Chapter 1. At 3 years old, he's king of a deserted island jungle. The last thing Kyle remembered before everything went wrong was the cold metal of a 100-ton truck filling his vision. There was the thunder of brakes, the smell of hot rubber, and, oddly, an electronic jingle playing somewhere nearby. Above it, a high, childish voice yelled something that sounded like a line from some anime. "Sister, sister, I'm a brain fruit user. Hand over your brain." Kyle blinked at the absurdity. "Thought it was just a speed bump," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. A different voice, flat and practical, said, "Go tell my insurance." "We're all just trying to get by," someone else added. Of all the things to be thinking about right then, Kyle's last coherent, bitter thought was completely modern and painfully mundane. Damn it, my 5 or 12 gigabytes of learning materials on that USB drive. Then there was a violent ripping pain. The world folded in on itself, and nothing but black. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer surrounded by asphalt and city noise. Salt air hit his face, sharp and bracing, mixed with the wild, green smell of a jungle. Towering trees blotted out the sky, their trunks thicker than telephone poles. Strange bird calls and the low, distant roars of animals echoed through the canopy. The ground under him was hard gravel, poking through whatever he was wearing and scratching his skin. What the hell? Where am I? Is this still my country? Kyle scrambled to his feet and looked around wildly. A small, thin voice answered him, so faint and delicate that for a split second he thought it belonged to one of the birds. Kyle froze. He spoke again, and the sound that came out of his own mouth was unexpected, high, breathy, childlike. Panic set in, colder than the sea breeze. Kyle felt his face, his arms, his chest. His hands were tiny, his clothes hung differently. He glanced down and saw a small body, not the man he had been in the city. The proportions were all wrong. Short limbs, pudgy knees, soft skin. He swallowed and tried to call out, but the voice came out even smaller than before. The realization hit him like a blow. He was not in his old body. He was small, 3 years old, by the feel of it, and stranded in a primeval jungle with nothing he recognized except the stubborn, undesired knowledge that his files, his life's work tucked onto a 512-get stick, might be gone. All around him, the jungle watched and listened. For a moment, the raw, ancient world seemed to measure this tiny human against itself. Kyle sat up, trembling, running his hands across his own limbs, as if to convince himself he hadn't simply dreamed it. Somewhere nearby, a soft, childlike voice, tender and weak, spoke again. Kyle's head snapped toward it, heart pounding. He had no idea what would come next, but one thing was already absurdly clear. He had woke up in the body of a toddler on a deserted island jungle. Good. His skinny arms and legs, his kidneys, his little life, all intact. What good is that, you idiot? He was a 3-year-old, stranded on a deserted island. How was any of this good? Memories from whatever life he'd had before flickered like shards of glass, impossible to piece together. The body he now occupied offered nothing useful either. Its recollections were jumbled, leaving only a vague impression of a shipwreck. Hunger announced itself first, sharp and immediate. Cold came next. A sea breeze slid through the thin, tattered clothes that clung to him, material he couldn't name, and noises from the trees at the edge of the beach made him flinch. Kyle's whole body trembled, not with tears but with raw, animal fear. Instinct pushed past the confusion and the unwillingness. He scrambled on hands and knees until he found a shallow cave, carved out by the waves. It was low and barely a shelter from wind and rain, but it was something. The cave smelled of salt and damp earth, sharp enough to make his eyes water, but he didn't care. He crawled to the back and curled up as deep as he could, listening to the ocean pound, ding against the rocks, and the faint, chewing sounds drifting from the jungle. "System," he whispered. "Ring, Grandpa?" Only the roar of the surf answered. His tentative calls were swallowed by the sea. Kyle closed his eyes, forced himself to breathe evenly, and let the panic ebb away until all that was left was the steady rhythm of the waves. Good news, I'd transmigrated. Bad news, it had started out like a survival show from hell. I am Kyle Grills, not really, and I'm going to show you how to survive in some of the most extreme and dangerous places. I said to no one, because back in my old life, in an era of peace, I was the ultimate couch potato. I was the guy who typed, "I could do that too," under wilderness videos, and then went straight back to the sofa. All mouth, no experience. Now I was in a cave, and my only audience was a puddle. I peered down at my reflection and almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Black hair hung damp around a small, delicate face. Golden eyes blinked up at me from the water. The face was thin, soft, and if you squinted it, had the faint promise of a handsome kid you'd see on the covers of novels. It was surreal, familiar in ways that tugged at memories of a life I'd left behind, but foreign in others. There was no time for vanity. If I wanted to avoid an early death, there was only one goal: survive. 3 years. Do you know how I spent those 3 years? I didn't sit around waiting for rescue or for some plot to save me. I ran, I climbed, I fought. I slept under stars and woke to learn what the wind meant by the way it shifted across a ridge. Every day was practice. Every day was an experiment in not dying. My body changed fast. Muscles tightened and grew in ways that didn't match the image of a normal child from my previous life's memories. I shouldn't have been this strong or this quick, but I was, and that realization hit me like cold water. This world wasn't ordinary. Something about it altered growth and potential, and whatever it was, it worked in my favor. Years of sprinting up slopes and hauling my own weight through forests honed me. My limbs became streamlined and dense with power, not bulky but compact and explosive. I learned to move quietly, to hold my breath until a predator passed, to make a spear from a broken branch in under a minute. I learned how to fall without breaking, how to make a splint from bark, how to read the sky for weather and the tracks in mud for a nearby herd. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was sharpening myself into a weapon of necessity, strong enough to climb sheer rock faces, agile enough to slip between an animal's senses, and quick enough to turn a mistake into a narrow escape. When I crouched by that puddle and watched my hands, calloused, steady, I felt something like resolve settle in. I still had the couch potato memories and the snarky inner voice that loved sitcoms and instant noodles, but those were faded now under the cadence of pulse and survival. If this world had given me a second chance, I would not waste it. I straightened, flexed my fingers, and listened. The cave breathed around me. The path ahead was uncertain and probably dangerous. But after 3 years of running, climbing, and fighting, I was ready to find out what waited outside. "Hey, brothers, I brought food again," Kyle announced, grinning as he expertly skinned the wild rabbit in his hands. He muttered to himself the whole time, punctuating his little victories with strange, excited chuckles. "Today's lunch, roasted rabbit, and I found some weird little fruits. Nice and chewy. Let's eat, brothers." Awesome," he added, burping contentedly after polishing off the rabbit. He settled onto a rock and held up the mysterious fruit he'd picked from the island. It was completely white, its surface patterned with a series of concentric rings, like ripples frozen on the skin. I feel like I've seen this before," he said, squinting. "Where was that? Doesn't matter. If it's edible, your brother Kyle will be the one to find out." He took a big bite. His face went from eager to green to pale in the space of a heartbeat. His stomach convulsed as if a riot had broken out inside him. Ugh. He started spitting and gagging, trying to chase the taste from his mouth. Kyle had eaten plenty of strange things, but nothing this foul. "It tastes like a month-old pair of moldy socks left baking in the sun," he spat, "mixed with a 3-month dead rat, slow-cooked for 49 days over an inferno." A faint, unpleasant aftertaste lingered, a barely detectable whiff of stench that made Kyle grimace as if his taste buds had been assaulted. He shook his head hard, trying to dislodge the devilish flavor and the memory of the fruit's strange appearance. There were more important things to worry about. The sun was already high, and the day's compulsory training hadn't begun yet. For 3 years he had lived like this. Now 6 years old, Kyle's small frame held strength and agility far beyond his years. He started the morning, as he always did, a naked run along the beach. His bare feet sank into the damp sand and sprang away with astonishing speed, leaving a trail of tiny footprints that the incoming tide quickly smoothed out. After the run came strength training. He had explored this jungle long ago and found a perfect gym, scattered rocks of every size and shape, just challenging enough to be useful. He lifted, carried, threw, and heaved, endless repetitions of the same motions, day after day. Kyle's muscles were far more developed than those of his peers, firm, hard, and long accustomed to that constant ache and burn. During training, he sometimes muttered curses in the language of his former life, and at odd moments he'd hum scraps of pop songs pulled from some dusty corner of his memory. Occasionally, the tune would dissolve into nonsense. "That day's squid! Squid up!" And he'd laugh to himself before falling back into work. He let out a low roar, veins standing out along his forearms, and lifted a boulder nearly twice his own height with an effortless shove. He hurled it with all his strength. It slammed into the distant sand with a dull, satisfying thud. Strength was one thing. Agility was another, and the jungle supplied both in abundance. This primeval wilderness was his obstacle course. Kyle vaulted from one fallen titan of a tree to another, slung himself through the canopy on thick, whipping vines, and twisted away from small predators that burst from the undergrowth trying to ambush him. Years here had sharpened his senses into something like a blade. Every breeze, every whisper of leaves, every tiny scrape told him exactly what was out there. Decisions came fast and with near-perfect certainty. As for fighting, there were no ornate techniques or flashy flourishes, only the raw, lethal skills carved out of constant danger. His moves were simple and direct, efficient, brutal, and built to end fights before they began. He practiced thrusts, chops, and sweeping strikes with a homemade spear against thick tree trunks, forcing himself to make every movement fast, precise, and merciless. Halfway through a flurry of blows, he barked at himself. "Eat my monkey steals the peaches." Ugh, what am I even saying? Be serious, Kyle. You're going to be the guy who punches Bear Grylls and kicks Ed Stafford. Every so often, he'd stop to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. A calculating look, too sharp for his years, would flash across his face. Then he'd smooth his expression and go back to the monotonous repetition. The sun slid toward the horizon, throwing a band of light and shadow across sky and sea. When the day's training finally wound down, he climbed up to his chosen viewing platform, the narrow lip of a cliff that fell away to the endless blue below. Fatigue rolled over him like a warm tide, sore limbs mixed with a quiet, odd satisfaction. It meant he'd survived another day and pushed his limits a little farther. On impulse, he flexed his arm. A hard bicep stood out, oddly disproportionate to his slender frame. Those muscles had been earned through sweat and repetition, not something a certain pointy-headed gentleman could honestly claim. "Homelander?" he muttered to the empty wind. No, I don't eat beef," Kyle muttered to himself. Bad news for the fitness world. A 6-year-old Superman with the power of 9 dragons lifting weights online. Those little mischievous fantasies were his antidote to loneliness. In the dull, repetitive grind of staying alive on the island, you had to find some way to amuse yourself. But beneath the jokes, there was a deeper unease. His body didn't behave like a normal child's. His growth, his strength, the way he healed, none of it made sense. Even allowing for the island's strange food and brutal environment, nothing should have pushed him into this state. The last sliver of sun slipped below the horizon, and pale stars pricked the sky. Kyle stretched and readied himself to head back to his small, safe cave. Night deepened. The waves lapped the shore in a steady whoosh, punctuated now and then by the chirp of unfamiliar night insects. Kyle lay deep in the cave on a thin mattress of dried, overlapping broad leaves. It barely qualified as a bed. Normally, after a day of hard physical work, he'd be out the moment his head hit that leafy pillow. Tonight was different. Thoughts kept coming back in waves, thin and restless like the tide leaving the shore, each one dragging up new, disordered images. Jungle shadows, the endless stretch of ocean, those strange, almost real creatures, and that damned white fruit, its taste, impossibly like dog poop. He shivered as the memory of that flavor rolled through him again. His stomach gave a faint, queasy twist. But it wasn't just the taste that bothered him. There was something about the fruit's skin. Concentric circles, rippling outward like waves in water. Spiral patterns. He felt sure he'd seen that design somewhere before, but the memory hovered just out of reach, blurred at the edges. It was like a puzzle with the most important piece missing, the picture almost clear, the gap maddening. A dull impatience that sat under his skin began to flare into irritation. Wait, spiral patterns? And that horrifying taste? The thought cut through the fog of exhaustion and left him sitting upright in the dim cave, hunting for the memory he couldn't quite summon. A lightning bolt struck his mind without warning, slicing through the fog. A long-sealed memory burst open like a floodgate, raw and impossibly vivid. It was a recollection from another life. A strange, fantastical world of reckless adventure, crews of pirates with every kind of personality, marines who swore to uphold justice, fierce, blood-soaked battles, and a fruit that granted magical powers. He remembered the fruit's signature spiral pattern. He remembered how it could bestow all manner of impossible abilities, and the terrible price. The sea would turn on anyone who ate it, leaving the eater hated by the waves and unable to swim. He even remembered the flavor, as if the world's most disgusting things had been mixed together and concentrated 81 times. Devil fruit. Kyle sat bolt upright on his deathbed in the dark cave, eyes wide, spiral patterns, the appalling taste, and his own body, which, even before he ever suspected eating such a thing, had already shown astonishing strength and an uncanny speed of recovery, all of it snapped into a new, terrifying clarity. The clues that had been scattered in his life now threaded together like pearls on a string. It made a kind of awful, unbelievable sense. The creatures on this island were enormous and behaved in ways that made no sense. The ocean stretched in every direction without end, and an unsettling sense of wrongness that had always nagged at him suddenly snapped into focus. The rules here, both physical laws and the very systems of power, were nothing like what he had known. He remembered the moment he'd been transmigrated, the abrupt shipwreck, the foggy fragments of the original body's memories, the image of a world made of endless seas dotted with countless islands. The realization hit him like a shock wave. He ground his teeth and breathed out, "Damn it, it's a devil fruit." The words came out low and ragged, shaking with a mix of fear and an excitement he hadn't expected. Here, his voice was barely more than a mosquito's buzz, yet it somehow carried the ridiculous weight of destiny. This is the world of One Piece. Chapter 2, Natural Pop Fruit. Dawn arrived, and Kyle woke with a thrill he couldn't put into words. He, Kyle, an ordinary nobody in his past life, had actually stepped onto a world full of wonders and adventure. Damn it, I'm really a devil fruit user. He pinched his thigh until it hurt. The sharp sting made him wince, but he laughed like an overexcited kid. The proof was there. This wasn't a dream. Once the initial euphoria faded, a more pressing desire took over. He had to get to sea. He wanted to find the legendary figures he'd only ever seen in memories and stories, to sail past those magnificent islands and endless blue oceans. Luffy, Zoro, just thinking about them set his blood racing. Reality, however, was a bucket of cold water. He looked around. A crude cave, an endless tangle of jungle, a narrow strip of beach. There wasn't a single decent piece of timber in sight. No way to build a seaworthy ship. "I can't possibly build a boat myself," he muttered. "If it isn't up to standard, it could sink on the first voyage. That would be the end of me." Dejected, Kyle slumped back onto a bed of dry leaves. For now, it seemed the only option was to wait and hope a ship happened to pass this lonely island. He couldn't afford to let the waiting drag on uselessly. "Devil fruit," Kyle muttered, staring at his hands with fiery eyes. What kind of power had that white devil fruit, the one that tasted like a chemical weapon, actually given him? There was nothing about it in the memories from his previous life. No notes, no description, no hint of an activation method. I need to figure this out fast. Over the next few days, Kyle threw himself into researching the fruit's ability. He tried everything he could think of, mimicking the stances and gestures of devil fruit users he'd seen in his old life, experimenting with breath and focus, testing different movements and rhythms. Nothing. No feedback, no change, not even the faintest tingle. "Am I doing it wrong?" he said to himself, rubbing his temples in frustration. He kept pushing. For several days he exhausted every technique he could remember, even ridiculous things, like shouting at the sea in a desperate attempt to provoke some reaction. The only result was a couple of seabirds circling down to scold him with indignant squawks. It grated on him. Why did other people get a starter package, 3 kinds of hockey, swordsmanship training, and clear fruit instructions, when they crossed into Pirate King territory, while he got nothing at all? That afternoon he fell back on routine to clear his head. Strength training. He hoisted a huge rock the way he always did, preparing to throw it, But the past few days of fruitless searching left him distracted and unfocused. He stumbled, and the rock slipped from his hand, tumbling toward the ground. Just as it was about to strike, a sudden, inexplicable flare of irritation rose in Kyle's chest. On impulse, he thrust his hand toward the falling stone. A low buzz radiated from his palm. An invisible ripple spread outward. When the boulder met that wave, it didn't hit the ground with a thud. Instead, it shuddered from the inside out and, with a small burst, collapsed into a heap of rubble. Kyle stared at the ruined rock, then down at his hand, his heart hammering. What the hell had that been? He tried to recreate the sensation. Focusing, he reached out again and fixed his mind on a large tree nearby. Buzz, another invisible pulse left his palm. The trunk, as thick as his waist, convulsed, a spiderweb of hairline cracks racing across its surface. With a sickening snap, the top half of the tree broke off and tumbled down, crashing into the earth and throwing up a cloud of dust. "Awesome!" Kyle cried, leaping about 3 feet into the air. "This is my ability!" He landed and forced himself to calm down. It wasn't simply making things vibrate, not a crude physical shaking, but the control of a deeper kind of wave. A shock wave? An oscillation? He closed his eyes and let the picture of his old physics classes flood back in. Transverse waves, longitudinal waves, mechanical waves, electromagnetic waves. All the textbook definitions, classifications, and properties he had learned in his previous life came rushing up. If it were just a basic shock wave or an ordinary oscillation, the effect would be broad and brute. Things would be thrown aside, buildings would rattle, structures would collapse outward. What he had felt was different, localized, tearing things apart from the inside. It had been about frequency, about resonance. Kyle frowned, trying to pin down that distinct sensation again, a precise matching of oscillation that attacked internal cohesion rather than producing outward force. In a place like the world of Pirate King, where most people were illiterate and a handful of learned words made someone seem cultured, Kyle's sudden command of physics made him feel almost like an Einstein dropped into the past. There was something almost scientific in the way those devil fruit powers behaved, patterns and clues Kyle could read if he looked for them. In his previous life, he'd spent hours on forums watching self-styled experts post wild, half-baked explanations about two-dimensional physics. Back then, he'd laughed it off as entertaining nonsense. He never imagined that those scraps of strange knowledge would one day become useful survival tools. People liked to joke that devil fruits were wasted on brutes who fought by instinct. Take that kindergarten principal, for example. A man carrying light-speed powers who still limited himself to straightforward kicks and laser blasts, practically making a mockery of photons. In the hands of someone who understood the underlying physics, the same ability could be applied to things like gravitational lensing, energy conversion, or even controlled time dilation. Kyle didn't fully buy either extreme. Combat and scientific research were different disciplines, and not every fighter needed to be a theorist. Still, a solid grasp of the science behind a devil fruit opened up possibilities, new techniques, safer control, more creative and effective uses. That kind of understanding, he knew, would be an advantage he couldn't afford to ignore. Kyle's heart hammered. Was this a logia or a paramecia? If it was a logia, he could turn his body into vibration waves, become immune to physical attacks, and manipulate all kinds of waves, the very definition of a top-tier logia. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to calm the tremor in his hands, and tried to will the power out of him. He pictured his flesh breaking down into countless ripples of vibration. At first, nothing happened. He tried again and again, refusing to be discouraged. On the next, ultra-focused attempt, a strange lightness washed over him. His limbs felt as if they were losing weight, as if they were less solid. He glanced down and saw it. His arm was partly transparent, edges shimmering with faint ripple-like patterns. He picked up a small stone and threw it at the semi-visible limb. The rock passed through without resistance, as if there were nothing there. It was real. "Logia," he breathed, scarcely able to keep his composure. "It's really a logia." He could hardly contain his excitement. The discovery felt like tears threatening to spring to his eyes. From that day on, Kyle threw himself into mastering his devil fruit ability, training obsessively to explore everything his newfound logia could do. The first thing Kyle worked on was elementalization. At the start, he could barely convert a single limb into a wavering form, unstable and glitching like badly streamed video. It was more hindrance than help. But with relentless practice, the effect steadied. He learned to shift his entire body into an invisible vibration, a state that didn't have a solid shape yet, but made him immune to conventional physical attacks. That alone was a huge step forward in his early training. After that, he moved on to directional impact. The idea was simple in theory: compress the vibration and then release it suddenly, focusing the energy into a concussive blast, essentially an air cannon. Kyle experimented obsessively with how much to compress the wave and the timing and technique of the release. Little by little, the power climbed. At first, his blasts only knocked down small trees, then they began shattering stone, and eventually he could send a several-meter-high wall of water surging across the sea surface. Developing high-frequency oscillation went smoother than he expected. He discovered he could impose a specific vibration frequency onto an object so its internal structure resonated and came apart. In the beginning, he could only turn pebbles to powder. With refinement, though, he dialed in frequencies and delivery so precisely that a boulder taller than he was crumbled into fragments in a matter of seconds. By the end of the day, his progress was unmistakable. What had started as jittery, half-formed effects had become reliable and destructive techniques. Each new trial taught him how far he could push the vibrations and how to shape them into something useful. This would be a godsend against those tin can marine warships, or against any weapon-wielding devil fruit user. Kyle thought, picturing himself waving a hand and watching the enemy's swords, breastplates, and helmets crumble to dust. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Days slipped by in the same steady rhythm, training, testing, refining. Kyle soaked up everything he could, lessons from his past life, hard-earned experience in this one, like a sponge, and the fruit's powers slowly revealed themselves. He'd given it a name, the Logia boba fruit. Today he was at his usual spot, the highest cliff on the island, shirtless, bronze skin catching the sun, every muscle smooth and coiled with latent power. He began his drills. First came a set of evasive exercises for his elemental form. Imagining enemies rushing in from all directions, he shifted his body between solid and vibrating wave states, sending quick gusts of displaced air with each motion. Then he inhaled deeply and thrust both palms forward. Boom, boom. 2 concussive blasts rolled out across the cliffside, sharp, hollow detonations that sent pebbles skittering and carved shallow craters into the rock. The gusts flared outward like blown bubbles, shimmering briefly in the sunlight before collapsing with ripples of displaced air. Kyle watched, satisfaction settling into his chest. The power felt right, and he knew there was much more to unlock. Boom! 3 solid shockwaves tore through the air in quick succession, each one striking the 3 floating wooden stakes Kyle had set out on the sea dozens of meters away. The stakes exploded into splinters. Chips of wood rained across the water. Kyle wiped sweat from his brow and muttered, "Still not focused enough. Still a long way from a star-shattering cannon." He was about to resume practicing his high-frequency oscillation and try to disintegrate a strange metal ore he'd picked up when something at the edge of his vision caught his attention, a tiny black speck on the distant horizon. Kyle's heart leapt. He concentrated, pushing his vibration sense to its limit. A moment later, his pupils tightened. It wasn't a buoy or a distant rock. It was the silhouette of a ship. A flag snapped at the bow in the sea breeze, a ferocious skull above 2 crossed scimitars. A pirate ship. Kyle's pulse hammered in his ears. Excitement flooded him, almost uncontrollable. 3 years are up, he thought with a grin. Welcome to the sea, Dragon King. Chapter 3: Pirates. Kyle held his breath and melted into the shadow at the cliff's edge. Only a pair of golden eyes showed as he watched a small ship slowly make its way closer. It wasn't big, maybe room for 20 at most. The hull was weather-worn and the sails stitched with patches. This was no wealthy privateer. The figurehead was the sort of cliché every beginner pirate went for, a snarling skull with 2 crossed cutlasses beneath it. Finally, Kyle whispered. 3 years. 3 long years, surviving like a wild man on this island, and at last there was a chance to leave. Even so, he didn't leap down to stage any grand Dragon King's return. Caution was rule number one for anyone who'd been transmigrated into a strange world. Rush in and you got yourself killed. He stayed hidden, watching as the ship dropped anchor a little way from the shore. A few of the crew jumped overboard and waded through knee-deep water toward the beach. 12 in all. Ragged, grubby, and careless with their appearance, each man or woman carried a cutlass at their hip or a flintlock slung over a shoulder. They looked like desperados who had lived by the sword for years. At their head was a broad-shouldered, bearded man with a crimson cloth tied around his waist and a spiked club, bigger than a man's head, slung over his shoulder. He cursed as he barked orders to his crew. "All of you, hurry up, find fresh water and food, and see if there's anything valuable on this godforsaken island." "Yes, Captain," several pirates answered with grins and laughter, then scattered to search. Kyle drew his presence in tight and silent, then activated his boba fruit ability. An invisible vibrational sense rippled outward from him like a radar sweep, probing the newcomers. He let the impressions wash over him, cataloging strength and intent. Mediocre, he thought. Compared to the monsters of the first half of the Grand Line, with bounties in the tens or even hundreds of millions of berries, these men were little more than cannon fodder. They were fierce enough, but he felt no oppressive aura of a true powerhouse and sensed no trace of hockey. They shouldn't be a problem. He was hiding on high ground with a clear view. Every movement of the pirates below was plain to see. I can't reproduce or expand on sexual violence. Below is a polished rewrite that preserves the characters, tone, and brutality of the scene while removing explicit sexual content. Several pirates prowled the shoreline, grumbling about the island's emptiness. What could there possibly be here? A tall, thin man muttered, kicking at a pebble. This place is a waste. At least there's fresh water, the scarred man with yellow teeth said with a croaky laugh. Captain, remember that last place, the little village? We walked away with a fortune from there. The bearded captain chuckled, swelling with pride. Those villagers thought they could resist? I smashed them with a single swing of my spiked club and left no one standing, and we took what we wanted without mercy. A monkey-faced pirate at his elbow snorted, sour and resentful. You were too quick, Captain. You killed 2 of them after we just started questioning. The crew didn't get their share. Nobody had the fun they were looking for. What are you worried about? The captain barked. Once we stock up, we'll sail the nearby isles. I'll see to it you all get your fill. This island may be barren, but there's always somewhere else to raid. Those who don't cooperate, men will be killed and fed to the fish, and the women. The bearded captain broke off with a disgusting, triumphant cackle. His crew answered with raucous laughter and a stream of filthy jokes. They spoke openly and casually about the loot they'd taken, about the village they'd slaughtered, as if discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. The last flicker of amusement left Kyle's face. He had allowed himself a sliver of hope. He'd thought he might be able to negotiate amicably, to use a few of his special tricks and talk his way into a lift with them, but whatever clever plan he'd kept in reserve evaporated in that moment. These men were vile. They weren't just rough or ruthless. They were despicable scum who deserved to die. The world of the Pirate King wasn't all sunlit adventure and fierce camaraderie. The cruelty hinted at in the manga's cover stories, the brief asides and throwaway lines, were not exaggeration. Here, the darkness and brutality were real and unvarnished. Violence, malice, blood, this was one of the truer faces of the Great Sea. He wasn't a saint. He knew his own compromises. But hearing them joke about murder and whatever they implied for the women made indifference impossible. Besides, the arrival of these scumbags gave him a convenient, even reasonable, excuse to seize a ship. Looks like my first real fight will be with you lot, Kyle said as he rose, a cold, murderous light in his eyes. He took a breath and deliberately did not leap from the cliff as everyone expected. Instead he shouted, loud enough for the scattered pirates to hear, "Surrender at once! You're surrounded!" That shout fixed their attention toward the cliff, and while they searched, he circled silently through the jungle to where they were spread out. One lone pirate cursed as he hacked at tangling vines with his cutlass, oblivious to the presence behind him. Kyle materialized like a ghost. His right hand formed an impossible, phantom grip, and a silent pulse of vibrating energy condensed in the air. The pirate's movements froze. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The cutlass clattered from his hand. His body slumped as if his bones had been emptied out. A faint crackling came from within him, and dark red blood seeped slowly from all 7 of his orifices. He was dead in an instant, without so much as a cry. Kyle stared at the scene, his stomach twisting. He'd steeled himself for this, but the reality of taking a life up close was far harsher than he'd expected. He forced the unease down and turned his attention to another figure nearby. "Who?" a pirate snapped, having heard something. He pivoted just in time to feel a barely perceptible pressure wave hit him. With a dull, sickening crack, his chest collapsed as if struck by an invisible hammer. He flew backward, tearing down a young tree, coughing up blood, the wound fatal. "Enemy attack!" someone finally shouted in alarm. The bearded captain on the beach went pale and bellowed, "Who is it? Get out here!" Kyle said nothing. He stepped out of the tree line into the sunlight, black hair, golden eyes, expression cold and unreadable. The captain stared, momentarily taken aback. "Hey, kid," he managed, then sneered, "You insolent fool! How dare you lay a hand on my men? Brothers, chop him up for me!" The remaining 7 or 8 pirates howled and charged, blades flashing in the torchlight. Kyle didn't back away. He stepped forward, planted his feet, and thrust his hands out. Buzz, buzz, buzz. 3 concentrated shockwaves fanned out from his palms, cutting across the attackers in a precise arc. The pirates on the front line didn't even have time to scream before the force hit them. Bones splintering, flesh torn, blown backward in an instant. Whether any of them survived was anyone's guess. The men behind them froze, horror etched on their faces as they stared at Kyle. What kind of monster are you?" one of them stammered. Kyle didn't answer. His figure blurred, and in the blink of an eye, he was in front of the trembling pirate. A strange vibration ran up the man's arm. His heavy steel knife shivered and crumbled as if it were made of glass, collapsing into a pile of iron filings. "My knife?" Before he could finish, Kyle's hand came down in a chopping motion across the man's neck. The vibrating force sheared through, to the point of destroying the cervical spine. And the pirate went slack, collapsing to the deck. When the dust settled, only the bearded captain remained standing. He watched Kyle cut down his men as if they were nothing more than ripe fruit, his sneer wiped away, replaced by a lat, cold fear. At last he understood. He had angered someone he absolutely should not have. "Who exactly are you?" he barked, voice trying to sound tough while his hand, gripping the spiked club, trembled. Kyle advanced slowly, each step driving a spike of dread into the captain's chest. "A righteous drifter passing through," he said. Before the sentence finished, Kyle blurred into an afterimage and shot forward. The captain swung his spiked club in a savage arc, the blow whipping up a foul gust, but it struck nothing. For a heartbeat, Kyle's form went translucent like heat haze, and the club passed through him as if through air. Elementalization, the captain realized, his pupils pinpricking in alarm. Then Kyle's body snapped solid again. One hand was already pressed against the captain's chest. "I'll send you off," he said. "Go to hell and repent." Shockwave. Disintegration. The bearded captain's body shuddered, as if struck by an invisible hammer. His face froze in a mask of terror and pain. For a moment, he seemed to be tearing apart from the inside, fabric and flesh collapsing as if ground to dust by some unseen force. He tried to speak, but instead expelled a mouthful of blood and fragments of something internal, then crumpled to the sand, utterly still. The fighting was over. Kyle stood on the ruined beach, the sea breeze heavy with the metallic tang of blood. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls. The air was full of the low cries of the wounded and the sharp, startled squawk of seabirds. Kyle felt his face go cold and his stomach flip. He had expected the shock of battle, but not this. The memory of the captain's final convulsion was still vivid and wrong in his head. He couldn't hold it. With a dry, involuntary retch, he vomited up the roasted fish he'd eaten that morning. It tasted like salt and iron. This was the first time he had killed, and he had done it so many times over in a single sweep. Even though the victims had been vicious pirates, the physiological and psychological blow hit him harder than any drill. Breaking stones and felling trees during training had been one thing. This was another entirely. The practice dummies never bled. The ocean kept rolling on, indifferent, as Kyle stood trembling on the blood-stained sand. After a long while, he managed to recover. He rinsed his mouth with seawater and wiped the stains from his lips. So this is the world of the Pirate King," he murmured, a complicated edge in his voice. There was no triumphant music, no stirring speech, only cold corpses and the sickening tang of blood. Still, he didn't regret it. He walked over to the pirate ship and inspected the vessel that was about to become his. It was a little old, but seaworthy. "The beginner's welcome package has finally arrived," Kyle said with a pale, crooked smile. Although, the delivery guy could have had better manners. He jumped aboard and checked the stores. There was some fresh water and food, but not much. In one of the cabins, he found a small wooden box containing a handful of berries and a few pieces of jewelry that looked fairly valuable. "Better than nothing," Kyle muttered as he stashed the box away. Now he had a ship. He stood at the bow and stared out at the boundless sea, his eyes brightening. "Grand Line, here I come. Go to sea! Go to sea!" The words kept buzzing in Kyle's head. "I've gone to sea. Now give me more guidance." He cleared his throat. Why did that sound so ridiculous out loud? Shrugging off the odd thought, he pushed it aside, stepped into the ship's cabin, and began rifling through the boxes. These pirates had terrible taste. Most of the clothes smelled of sweat and blood. After a few minutes, he found a relatively clean crate and pulled out a black shirt and trousers. The fabric was rough and the outfit too large, but it was infinitely preferable to the patchwork of leaves and animal skins he'd been wearing. He changed and hunted up a smooth copper plate to use as a mirror. The face that stared back at him had jet black hair and golden eyes, skin tanned by long days in the sun. His features were sharp and well-defined. There was still a trace of boyishness to his face, but his eyes were startlingly bright. Those golden pupils seemed to catch and hold the dim light in the cabin, giving them an almost otherworldly gleam. Kyle couldn't help himself. He brushed his bangs back with a smug smile. "Well," he said to his reflection, more pleased than he'd expected, "I never imagined I'd be able to rely on my looks in this life." "What a pity," Kyle muttered to himself, staring at his reflection. "If this were my old life, I'd at least be campus heartthrob material, maybe even an internet celebrity." He grinned, enjoying the image for a moment, then headed back out to the deck. Miming the pirates he'd seen in films, he fussed with the rigging, adjusted the sails as best he could, and planted his hands on the helm. "All right, let's go," he shouted, sounding braver than he felt, as if he were about to conquer the sea and sky. And then nothing happened. An hour passed, and the ship was still lazily circling in the same patch of water. 2 hours later, he was soaked, exhausted, and more than a little discouraged, and oddly, the deserted island in the distance looked a bit closer than it had before. "What the? How do you even drive this thing?" Kyle barked, running a hand through his hair. Heat rose to his cheeks. The sight of his flushed, handsome face only made his frustration worse. In his previous life, he'd been painfully ordinary. He'd been on boats a few times, sure, but never actually in charge of one. And his swimming had always been barely adequate. He had absorbed a lot from movies and TV, how to trim the sails, how to tack into the wind, how to keep a steady helm. All the theory sounded convincing until he had the wheel in his hands and discovered just how nothing like driving a car real sailing actually is. He remembered when Luffy and his crew first set sail. It hadn't seemed this hard then. How did they manage before Nami joined, he wondered, a spike of self-doubt tightening in his chest. Kyle tried to use his boba fruit power, sending a shockwave against the hull to push them along. The result was a single, thunderous boom. The shock rolled over the sea, towering waves rose, and half of them crashed back over the deck, drenching him. An exhausting weakness washed through him. The boat lurched, and the recoil shoved them backward a short distance. He wiped seawater from his face and stared up at the sky, exasperated. There was nothing left to do but go with the flow. He stopped fighting and let the pirate ship drift like a leaf on the vast ocean. Days passed. Frustration gave way to helplessness, and helplessness to a dull numbness. Fresh water and food were visibly dwindling. Every day, when he wasn't staring blankly at the horizon, he practiced his boba fruit technique on the waves and prayed that the heavens would take pity and send them toward a populated shore. If this keeps up, I'll be the first pirate in the Pirate King world to starve to death at sea because I can't sail a ship. What a disgrace to the Transmigrator army. Kyle lay on the deck, on the verge of tears, so hungry he even missed the oddly flavored grilled fish from that deserted island. Just as he was starting to see stars and muttering to hi, myself, a small, blurry black speck finally resolved on the distant horizon. "Land! Land!" he shouted, springing up so suddenly he nearly unleashed a shockwave to propel himself. Only common sense stopped him. He had to conserve whatever energy he had left. Luck, or the ocean currents, was on his side. Over the next half-day, the shape of the island sharpened. A busy, prosperous shore with docks and a cluster of buildings. Tears pricked Kyle's eyes. He no longer cared about seamanship. Hand-trembling, he grabbed the helm and aimed the ship for the dock with nothing but desperate hope. His reckless steering caused immediate chaos at the port. Workers on the shore screamed and scattered as shouts filled the air. Several small skiffs were splintered to pieces when his pirate ship careened wildly through the harbor. Kyle was soaked with sweat. He didn't care about how he looked. He only wanted the battered ship to stop. At last, with a dull thud, the bow slammed into a thick wooden piling on the dock. The whole vessel shuddered and wedged itself fast. Perfect. Kyle didn't bother with the ship's ruined condition or the curious stares from bystanders. He jumped onto solid ground, and the feeling of the dock under his feet made him almost want to kneel and kiss it. He hurried after a passerby, forcing his face into what he hoped looked like a friendly expression. "Excuse me, sir, where is this, and what time is it?" The man flinched at Kyle's dusty, gaunt appearance, but answered, "This is the port on the outskirts of Dogtown. It's afternoon." "Dogtown?" Kyle went blank. He'd never heard the name. Pushing on quickly, he asked, "Then, how's the Pirate King doing now? And what about the Marine hero?" "Hey, do you know if there's a straw hat around?" The man stopped and gave Kyle a wild-eyed once-over. "Huh? What are you talking about? Never heard of them. Kid, you're talking nonsense. Must be starving or something." He brushed Kyle off like an annoyance and started to walk away. "Wait," Kyle called after him. "I didn't mean that. I meant what year it is on the sea calendar, not whether it's morning or afternoon." The man ignored him. Kyle stood there, baffled. How could tales of the Pirate King and the Marine heroes be completely unknown here? Even if Straw Hat Luffy hadn't yet made a name for himself, there should have been at least some rumor. Had he ended up in the wrong year? Or was Dogtown so isolated that news never reached it? Doubt settled over him like a fog as he moved down the street. The town itself bustled with life. People hurried past, vendors shouted their wares, and the market's clamor filled the air. Despite the activity, Kyle felt oddly cut off. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him of the few berries he'd managed to scrounge from the pirate ship. Would that handful be enough for a proper meal? He didn't know, but for now he kept walking, trying to figure out where or when he really was. Just as Kyle was about to head to a tavern and ask for more detailed information, a violent explosion ripped through the air from the direction of the port. Boom, screams followed, and people scattered in panicked, chaotic flight. "Pirates! It's the Black Shark Pirates! They're raiding again! Run!" Kyle glanced up. Thick smoke poured into the sky, and orange tongues of flame leapt above the warehouses. Out on the water, a pirate ship flew a flag with a shark skull and was indiscriminately bombarding the buildings along the shore. Cannonballs smashed into timber and stone, sending splinters and dust into the air. "Great, I haven't even eaten yet, and trouble's already found me." Kyle's mouth twitched, but beneath the irritation, something almost like excitement sparked in his golden eyes. Perfect. I'll use these fools to vent the frustration I've been holding in, and maybe borrow a little meal money while I'm at it. Chapter 5. Ace? Kyle ignored the townspeople's panicked cries and walked straight toward the harbor. Cannon fire thudded in the distance, and shrill screams cut through the air, but he didn't flinch. A fierce, uncontrollable excitement burned behind his golden eyes. The dull melancholy of drifting for days and the disorientation of arriving in a new world seemed to demand an outlet, and this thoughtless band of pirates had arrived at just the right moment. "Hey, brothers, this shop looks like it has a lot of loot," someone shouted, as the wooden door of a shop near the quay was kicked open. Several members of the Black Shark pirates grinned and surged inside, ready to plunder. Kyle slipped in behind them without a sound, his gaze sweeping the gang. A silent ripple of vibration sense spread outward from him, pinpointing the weapons at their waists and the weak spots on their bodies with unnerving precision. No sooner had his awareness stirred than the pirates who had been about to loot the place froze in place, trapped by that invisible pressure. The leader had just raised his scimitar, preparing to pry open a locked chest, when the steel in his hand suddenly hummed with a violent buzz. With a grinding crunch, it disintegrated into a pile of fine metal fragments that cascaded to the deck. My sword! What's happening? He stared at his empty hands, bewildered. Before he could react, a strange tingling crawled up from his gut, followed by fierce cramping, as if invisible hands were squeezing and kneading his insides. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Around him his comrades doubled over one by one, clutching their stomachs and convulsing. Foamy blood bubbled from their mouths and noses. The whole scene was eerily silent, broken only by the faint clatter of metal shattering and bodies hitting the planks. Kyle didn't spare them another glance. He walked straight toward his next target. That kid! He did it! Someone shouted. Fire! Kill him! Another barked. Finally, a pirate caught sight of the youth, who seemed to be reaping their lives like some silent specter, and screamed in horror. The threat of death snapped the other pirates back to attention. Muskets were raised in an instant, spitting lead, while swords and sabers flashed as men slashed from every direction. Kyle didn't flinch or fall back. As the bullets and blades closed in, his body blurred and twisted, one moment solid, the next like heat haze on a summer afternoon, the edges shimmering with faint ripples. Swish, swish, swish! The bullets tore through the shimmering outline and thudded into the wall behind him. The blades found nothing to cut, their strikes met only air, leaving only those faint ripples where they passed through. They cut nothing? What the? A ghost! He's a ghost! The pirates froze, terror making their movements stall. Kyle's lips curled into a cold smile. It was the first time he'd used elementalization so smoothly in actual combat, and it felt damn good. He moved like a man dancing on the edge of a blade, his form flickering between solid and blurred so fast it was hard to focus. Each flicker brought another pirate down. Sometimes a chest would cave in and their weapons would fly from their hands. Sometimes their eyes rolled back and tiny beads of blood welled at their mouths as they went limp, never even getting a chance to cry out. Too slow, too weak, Kyle mocked, his voice carrying over the chaos. He stopped abruptly, thrust both hands forward, and aimed at a dozen or so pirates gathered ahead of him, their faces registering nothing but uncertainty. A single, solid shockwave punched out first, cleaving a clean path through the air toward the group. Almost instantly, two more followed, boom, boom, hitting the same line. The dozen pirates barely had time to register what was happening before all three impacts struck. The force tossed them aside like rag dolls, and the blast was strong enough to collapse several nearby wooden houses. Planks, splinters, and sawdust hurled through the air, turning Taki's sky into a choking cloud of dust. The cacophony of battle at the port suddenly fell away. The townspeople who had been scattering and the surviving pirates stood frozen, staring at the terrifying sight before them. A monster! One of the pirates stammered, dropping his weapon and stumbling back in panic. Kyle was about to press his advantage and finish off the remaining men when a wave of dizziness hit him. His vision blurred. He grunted and forced himself to stay upright. The adrenaline that had been driving him ebbed like a receding tide, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The strain of pushing his devil fruit ability to its limits, combined with several days without proper food, was finally catching up to him. Damn it, he thought. I need to end this fast. Captain, that kid's weakening, a sharp-eyed pirate shouted, noticing Kyle's falter. The captain of the Black Shark pirates, a burly, scarred man who wielded a massive ship's anchor like a club, went pale with a mix of rage and disbelief. After years of ruling these waters, he hadn't expected to suffer such a setback at the hands of an unknown boy. Everyone attack! He roared. Kill him! The bounty doubles! The captain roared. A blade flashed from Kyle's side and rear. A tall, thin officer of the Black Shark pirates, eyes cold and cruel, had been watching from the shadows and struck as Kyle faltered. The tip of his long sword took on a black, oily sheen, as sudden and deadly as a striking viper aimed straight for Kyle's back. Kyle's mind reeled. This was the newbie village. How could anyone here wield armament hockey? He barely managed to twist aside in time. The blade ripped through fabric and flesh with a sickening rasp. It sliced along his ribs. Blood blossomed across his black shirt. Pain knocked the air from his lungs. He staggered back, leaning against a broken wall. The swordsman grinned like a predator. "Kid, your power's strange, but you're finished. I'm a master of armament hockey." He advanced, the long sword dripping, triumph glittering in his eyes. Kyle gulped for breath, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. Damn it, this opponent is insane, Kyle thought. Do even background fighters these days fake weakness just to set up ambushes? He cursed his luck, just out of the newbie village and about to die. "Mama, I'm going to turn into a starving ghost." "Just kidding. I lied," he muttered, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. A fierce light flared in Kyle's gaze. He blurred, splitting into two shadowy clones so that three silhouettes rushed the attacker from different directions. The swordsman hesitated, unsure, and scrambled to respond. Then a jet-black shape dropped out of the sky with impossible speed. A metallic clang rang out. Suddenly, a figure stood directly between Kyle and his target, wearing a straw hat Kyle knew all too well. The surprise strike sent the swordsman stumbling backward. His sword hand went numb, and his posture faltered as he stared at the newcomer in shocked uncertainty. Kyle's pupils snapped tight. A cold, monstrous surge ran through him. "Hey! Ace!" "Roger! Rayleigh! Roger! Rayleigh!" The cry echoed in Kyle's head like a distant memory. Then a piercing clang exploded by his ear. Metal rang so close his eardrums throbbed. A gleaming long saber was parried inches from his face. Kyle forced his eyes open. Blurry from blood loss and exhaustion, his vision swam. The first thing he saw was the back of a young man wearing a straw hat. The style and color of the hat and that familiar profile made a name leap into his mind. "Ace! Ace?" Kyle whispered, his voice dry and hoarse with disbelief. Why was he here? The timeline didn't make sense. The straw-hatted youth didn't bother to look back. He gave a single flick of his wrist, sending an overwhelming force down the blade in his hand. The black shark pirate swordsman, already stumbling backward, felt that force surge into him. The webbing between his thumb and forefinger split, his grip on the saber snapped, and the long blade flew from his hand with a metallic clank. He was thrown backward, shaken and pale with horror. Finally, the straw-hatted man turned. He grinned, showing a neat row of white teeth. "Hey, you all right?" he asked. The sunlight hit him full on, lighting a young, chiseled face that bristled with confidence and vitality. His smile was easy, but his eyes were the real thing, sharp and predatory, like an eagle's, as if they could see straight through a person. That smile, that look, Kyle's pupils suddenly constricted. "Sorry, sir, I didn't recognize you at first." "No, wait, it's not Ace. It's Ace's father, Gol D. Roger, the young pirate king." An invisible aura drifted off Roger, not an obvious show of force, but something primeval and unavoidable. It made the rowdy pirates around him shudder as if some ancient beast had fixated on them. They instinctively took a few steps back, wide-eyed with fear. "You, who are you?" The black shark pirate's captain bellowed, brandishing a massive ship anchor in a display of bluffing bravado. He could feel, somehow, that this straw-hatted kid in front of him was no pushover. Roger ignored him. Instead, he studied the disheveled Kyle and the chaotic mess of bodies behind him with obvious amusement. "Incredible," he said. "You took out this many pirates by yourself? Kid, you've got some skills." A sudden clatter of hurried footsteps came from the edge of the harbor. "Marines! The Marines are here! The G Branch Marines! Run!" The shout sent the remaining pirates into a panic. Their already shaky formation collapsed into chaos. Marines in standard uniforms poured in from all sides, rifles leveled at the center of the docks. The lead officers, their shoulders marked with Lieutenant Colonel insignia, looked grim, clearly the elite of the Dogtown Marine G Branch. "All pirates, drop your weapons and surrender at once. Any resistance will be met with lethal force." A Marine Lieutenant Colonel bellowed, his voice echoing across the port. The Marines' arrival only made the situation more desperate. A cold, ruthless light flashed in the black shark pirate's captain's eyes. He knew escape was out of the question. "Brothers, fight! Kill those two troublesome brats first, "Then break out," he roared, pitching forward and swinging his massive ship's anchor as he charged Roger and Kyle. The rest of the crew howled in response, surging forward for a last-ditch struggle. "Bring it on! Kua!" Roger bellowed, grinning wide as he faced the hurled ship anchor and the tide of Marines bearing down on him. There wasn't a trace of panic in his voice. In his hand was no legendary saber, just an ordinary cutlass, but it seemed to hum with a terrifying power. With a single, blinding flash of steel, the movement was over before anyone could track it. The heavy anchor met the blade and split cleanly in two, as if it were rotten wood. The cut was polished and mirror smooth. Roger moved through the crowd like a specter, each sweep of his blade driven with brutal, commanding force. The first pirates and Marines who lunged at him never had a chance to see his footwork. They were thrown back by the blade's violent shock, bodies skidding and blood spraying. His style was broad and direct, deceptively simple, but there was an uncanny rhythm and raw power behind every strike, as if each blow could split mountains and crack stone. When the rush finally passed, the adrenaline that had been carrying him ebbed away like a retreating tide, leaving him hollowed out and bone-tired. Kyle pressed his back to the wall, every breath stabbing at the wound just beneath his ribs. He was weak, bloodless, and trembling, but he couldn't look away from Roger's fight. Is this the future Pirate King? Roger moved with a calm, absolute authority Kyle had never seen. Every step, every feint, every strike carried a certainty that made Kyle's earlier battles against petty pirates feel like children playing at war. Each swing of Roger's sword and each graceful dodge was burned into his mind. "Is this hockey?" Kyle whispered. He couldn't put it into words, but he could feel something in Roger's attacks that went beyond mere physical force. Exhaustion, blood loss, and days without proper food had finally caught up with him. A wave of dizziness rolled over him, the world tilted and blurred. The clash of steel, the Marines' shouts, and the pirates' screams seemed to come from far away, like sounds through water. "Damn it, my body, I can't move," he ground out, fighting to stay awake as his eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Just as the Marines tightened their lines, hemming Roger in and working to surround him, a golden figure tore into the chaos like a bolt of lightning across the night. Clang! 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 The crisp ring of steel met steel cut through the air, punctuated by the startled screams of several Marines. The newcomer moved with the speed of a streaking light. His cutlass traced a dazzling curtain of golden sparks, each flash precise and elegant, and each one ending a life. His style wasn't Roger's raw, overwhelming power, but a quicksilver blend of agility and technique, no less lethal for its finesse. "Rayleigh!" Roger laughed when he saw him, and his own attacks grew even more ferocious. The new fighter was none other than a young Silvers Rayleigh, the future wielder of Pluton. He wore his medium-length golden hair loose, small round glasses perched on his nose. His demeanor was calm, but a sharp glint lived behind his eyes. Rayleigh's arrival immediately shifted the balance. With Rayleigh on one flank and Roger on the other, they became two razor-sharp, unbreakable blades, slicing effortlessly through the Marines' encirclement. "Honestly, Roger, you always make such a scene." Rayleigh easily parried a slash from a Marine lieutenant colonel, still finding the leisure to taunt. "Ha! I was just passing by," Roger called back carelessly, sending several pirates sprawling with a single backhand sweep. Kyle's consciousness teetered on the edge. He only vaguely made out Rayleigh's shape before the last of his strength ebbed away. Young Roger, Rayleigh. He tried to hold on to the images, but darkness kept pulling him under. This was 50 or 60 years before the events of the main story. The remaining Black Shark pirates had been broken by the sudden turn of events. Many were already terrified, either cut down effortlessly by Roger and Rayleigh, or dropping their weapons and fleeing. Even the Marine G-Branch soldiers, well-trained and disciplined, were no match for the two future legendary pirates, and their casualties mounted with every passing moment. Roger and Rayleigh stood back to back, shielding the barely conscious Kyle between them as enemies surged in from all directions. The setting sun cast their three long shadows across the quay. Smoke hung heavy in the air, and the harbor tasted of iron and blood. It was a brutal, chaotic slaughter, and at the same time the beginning of a legend. In the unremarkable port of Dogtown, the grand era of the Pirate King seemed to draw its curtain quietly, and at its edge a soul that had been ripped from another world slipped away. Kyle's eyelids finally closed. His last conscious imp restions were Roger's booming laugh and the bright gleam on Rayleigh's blade. Chapter 7. A tribute to the legendary succubus Gol D. Roger. The port's clamor slowly faded. The last of the Black Shark pirates and a scattering of marines lay strewn about, and the air tasted of blood and gunpowder. Roger casually kicked side a pirate who'd been foolish enough to try an ambush, flicked the blood from his sword, and flashed a grin that showed 2 perfect rows of teeth. Koo-ha! This still isn't enough, Rayleigh. Rayleigh sheathed his blade, and, behind his spectacles, swept his gaze over the ruined dock. At the edge of the chaos, his eyes settled on Cale, slumped unconscious against a wall. His voice was calm. You gonna take him? Roger's laugh bubbled up again. Koo-ha! This kid's spectacular! He strode over and hoisted Cale up with one hand. That devil fruit and that ruthless desperation suits me to a T. Rayleigh rubbed his forehead and let out a wry sigh. He knew his captain better than anyone. Once Roger made up his mind, not even 10 Sea Kings could have dragged him back. It reminded him of how Rayleigh had been taken, ship and all, with nothing more than a few words. Run! Marine reinforcements are probably coming. Don't linger, Roger shouted. Cradling Cale, he called to Rayleigh, and then, with surprising agility, the two of them leapt onto a small sailboat moored at the edge of the pier. The craft was little more than a step up from the Black Shark pirates, a ramshackle ship. Some amount of time later, Cale drifted back into consciousness to the steady sway of a boat. Bright sunlight stabbed through the cabin porthole and made him squint. He shifted, and a sharp pain flared through his ribs. He drew a ragged breath. Hiss! I'm alive? He wondered. He was lying in a simple hammock. The cabin was small but neat. Hey, you're awake, kid? A warm, hearty voice called. Cale blinked up and found a young Roger sitting cross-legged on a nearby wooden barrel, grinning widely with a half-eaten piece of meat clamped in one hand. You saved me? Cale croaked as he tried to sit up. Roger laughed, a booming, carefree sound. Ha! It was nothing. I'm Gol D. Roger. He waved the introduction off casually, then pointed at Cale's ribs as if making a note of the bruise there. Your wound? Roger said, nodding toward the bandage. Rayleigh already gave it a quick treatment. Damn, what did you do, kid? You took on an entire pirate ship by yourself and nearly cleaned them out. What kind of devil fruit is that? Sounds interesting. Can it smash things apart? Cale felt his chest tighten under the way Roger's eyes seemed to pierce right through him. There was no point hiding from a man like that. He forced his voice steady. I'm Cale, Aaron Cale. It's a paramecia type, the boba fruit. Roger's surprise flickered across his face, then shifted into full, eager interest. Amazing to have that kind of strength and guts at your age. Excellent, excellent. He tossed the bone he'd been chewing aside, clapped his hands once, and turned his full attention on Cale. A broad, infectious grin split his face, and his eyes burned with a sudden, fierce light. Little Cale, I like you. How would you feel about sailing with us? Come see what the true sea is like. He held out a hand, large, hard, the palm calloused from years of sword and sea. The invitation landed with the casual weight of someone used to changing lives. Cale's heart began to pound so hard he could feel it in his throat. When Cale thought of a succubus, the image in his head was predictable. High heels, sheer stockings, long legs, and a narrow waist. What stood before him now was nothing like that. Comrade, Roger said, voice low and steady, are you willing to change the world with me? Damn, the legendary succubus Roger was making his move. Who could stand against that? Cale felt the heat of excitement flush up from his chest. He forced himself to sit up in the hammock. The old wound in his ribs flared with a knife-sharp pain, but he kept his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. He drew a breath. His voice trembled with eagerness, but it was clear. I want freedom. I want to see more of the world. I want the power to make my dreams real. If I could be with you all. He didn't finish the sentence, but his hunger for adventure, his thirst for the unknown, and the sense of liberation that seemed to radiate from Roger were plain as day. Roger's smile widened until it lit his face. His eyes shone with an extraordinary light. Rayleigh, who had been standing silently in the cabin doorway cleaning his sword, looked up, His gaze lingered on Kale for a moment before flicking to Roger. He gave a barely perceptible nod. "Koo-ha!" Roger exploded into a booming laugh, equal parts exhilaration and triumph. He seized Kale's outstretched hand and crushed it in a fierce grip. "Good! Well said!" His voice rang like a great bell. "From today on, Kale is the third crew member of the Roger Pirates." "Third?" Kale blinked, stunned. "That's right," Roger said, slapping his chest with pride. He jabbed a thumb toward Rayleigh. "Me, Captain Gol D. Roger, that fellow with the glasses, First Mate Silver's Rayleigh, and you, exactly 3. Kale stared at the man who would one day be the Pirate King. Roger laughed like a child who'd just been given his favorite toy, and Kale's chest tightened with conflicting emotions. This was Gol D. Roger? There was none of the legendary inscrutability or the forced regal bearing Kale had imagined, only a raw, wholehearted grandeur, an unreserved joy, and an indefinable charisma that made it impossible not to be swept along. Roger burned like a living beacon, effortlessly sparking the excitement of everyone around him. People found themselves wanting to follow him, to take the risk with him, to witness whatever grand wonders lay ahead. From that single, brief meeting, Kale could already feel the rare pull of Roger's leadership. "Welcome aboard, Kale," Rayleigh said as he stepped forward, offering a small smile. He was still restrained, but the earlier scrutiny was gone. "Please guide me from now on, Captain Roger, Mr. Rayleigh," Kale replied earnestly, barely able to contain his anticipation. A legend, it seemed, was about to set sail from this modest pirate ship. Chapter 8. The young man fell asleep. The ship had been cutting through the endless sea for several days. Kyle's youth worked in his favor. After days of plentiful food and rest, the wound along his ribs had completely healed, and he felt more energetic than ever. Every day he watched Roger, laughing loudly into the wind at the bow, arm wrestling with Rayleigh, a contest that usually ended with Roger cheating, or humming off key tunes, and the captain's boundless vitality stirred something inside him. That contagious energy made Kyle restless in a way he hadn't expected. That afternoon the sun was just right, and a gentle breeze ruffled the sails. Roger had just finished tearing into a huge roasted sea beast leg, and was picking at his teeth with obvious satisfaction. Rayleigh leaned against the mast, casually running a cloth along a rapier that looked ordinary at a glance, but held a keen edge underneath. Kyle stretched, feeling the power surging through him, and finally couldn't hold back. He took a few quick steps toward Roger, his eyes burning. "Captain," he called. Roger lifted his head lazily. What's the matter, little Kyle? Hungry?" Roger teased. "Duel with me, Captain." Kyle's voice wasn't loud, but it held the reckless boldness of a calf that hasn't yet learned to fear a tiger. He needed to know how he measured up to Roger. Roger paused, the toothpick between his teeth stilling for a moment, then let out his trademark booming laugh. "Koo-ha! Interesting!" At that, Rayleigh stopped polishing his sword. The eyes behind his glasses softened into a faint smile. He, too, was watching with interest. The crew quickly cleared a space on the deck. Kyle drew a deep breath and took a fighting stance. He knew there was a vast gulf between himself and Roger, and that very gap only sharpened his resolve. He wanted to see how many moves he could hold against the man who would become the Pirate King if he truly went all out. "Here I go, Captain," he cried. His body wavered for an instant. Light illusion, mirage. The air around him shimmered and twisted like ripples across water. In the next heartbeat, 3 identical Kyles stood on the deck. Each one radiated the same presence. Their faces wore the same expression. It was nearly impossible to tell which was real. The 3 Kyles formed a triangle and rushed Roger from 3 directions at once, the air whistling around them. The Kyle on the left brought a hand knife down toward Roger's neck. The one on the right lashed out with a swift kick aimed at his lower body, and the Kyle directly in front clenched both fists, ready to unleash a shock punch. It was the best way he could think to combine the deceptive and offensive elements of light illusion mirage. Even if only one body was real, the other 2 illusions would distract an opponent and open a window for the true strike. "Roger, can you take a punch built on 30 years of physics?" Kyle thought, eager for the result. Roger, however, merely stood there, lazily picking his nose. The smile on his face didn't change, only a small glint of approval flickered in his eyes. "Wow, Sugoi," he murmured. As the three attacks were about to land, Roger moved. His motion was not fast. In fact, it was remarkably simple. There was no dodging, no blocking. Roger casually raised his right hand and, facing the Kyle charging straight at him, threw a lazy hook. The punch landed with a dull thud. The light and shadow clones shattered instantly. Kyle felt a brutal hook, indescribable force slam into his gut. His vision spun and his thoughts scattered. Did I get lucky again? One amazing thing after another. Roger, you. The rest of the sentence never finished. Kyle's body arched sharply, like a shrimp curling under heat. His feet left the deck, and then he collapsed onto the planks, eyes rolling back as he passed out. It all happened so fast that no one had time to react. 1 second there had been 3 Kyles swarming him. The next, only one lay motionless, fallen into a childlike sleep. Silence settled over the decks, AT for the sea breeze whispering through the canvas. Roger withdrew his fist, gave his hand a casual shake as if flicking off dust, and grinned down at the unconscious Kyle. "Koo-ha! You, what a thing. Go on and sleep it off." Rayleigh walked over slowly and glanced at Kyle, who was curled up and still unconscious. An amused, helpless half-smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Looks like he won't wake up before dinner. Roger, you really are heavy-handed." "Koo-ha! Little Kyle's tough." Roger laughed, completely unbothered. He bent down, scooped Kyle up like a small chicken, and slung him over his shoulder. "Come on, Rayleigh. Let's see if we can bag something big for dinner today." The rich smell of roasting meat, warm and irresistible, pulled Kyle out of his daze. He opened his eyes to the last light of the setting sun streaming through the porthole, painting the swaying cabin in orange-red. His stomach growled. He was starving. A dull ache from Roger's earlier punch still throbbed in his ribs and belly, a painful reminder of that brutal duel from the afternoon. "Ugh!" Kyle groaned, rubbing his forehead as he sat up. A brief, relieved thought crossed his mind. At least he hadn't transmigrated again. Outside the cabin, Roger's unmistakably loud voice called, amused and loud. "You awake?" Leaning against the wall and still a little unsteady, Kyle pushed himself up and staggered out. A bonfire burned brightly on the ship's deck. Over the flames hung an unfamiliar seabird, roasted to a golden brown and dripping with fat, filling the air with a mouth-watering smell. Roger had a dagger in hand, tearing off chunks and stuffing them into his mouth, oil running down his chin. Nearby, Rayleigh sat with quiet elegance, neatly trimming the meat on his plate with a small knife, a sharp contrast to Roger's rough manner. "Ha! Just in time, little Kyle! Tonight's dinner's a treat." Roger called as Kyle appeared, waving him over and pointing to an empty wooden crate by the fire. Kyle's stomach growled even louder. He didn't bother with ceremony. He walked over, sat down on the crate, and accepted the knife and fork Rayleigh offered. Starved, he ignored the utensils and, like Roger, ripped a huge piece from a bird leg with his bare hand and bit in. Delicious," he said around the meat. It was tender with a faint smoky flavor, the best thing he'd eaten since his transmigration. He devoured most of the roasted bird in no time, and only then did the gnawing hunger in his belly finally ease. Kyle let out a satisfied burp, then winced as the memory of the afternoon's humiliation came back. He set the cleanly gnawed bone down and stared at Roger, who was idly picking his teeth with a smug look. "Captain," Kyle said, voice tangled with awe, annoyance, and a burning curiosity, "that punch you threw this afternoon, what was that about?" "I used light illusion mirage, attacked from 3 directions at once." He still couldn't make sense of how Roger had instantly found his true body and with one casual blow knocked him out. Roger paused his toothpicking, glanced up, and grinned. He stuck out the hand that had landed the punch, wiggled the fingers at Kyle, and said in an exaggeratedly obvious tone, "Oh, that! It was just a bang! One good hit, and you fell asleep." "Koo-ah!" Kyle's mouth twitched. "I'm asking how you did it," he repeated. Roger considered the question, rubbing his chin as if thinking it over. After a beat, he slapped his thigh and said, half serious, half mocking, "Maybe your weak point is too obvious. Those 3 shadows made my eyes go fuzzy, so I just picked one that looked right and threw a punch. Turned out to be the real you. Lucky me." "Luck. Pure luck. Koo-ah!" "You call that luck?" Kyle nearly spat a mouthful of stale blood. That elegant, almost aristocratic put-down hurt more than a direct insult about his weakness. Rayleigh, sitting beside them, set down his knife and fork, dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin, and there was a faint smile behind his glasses, said quietly, Roger simply didn't bother distinguishing between your illusions. To him, attacking any of them was the same. That's exactly it, Roger crowed triumphantly. Rayleigh understands me best. Little Kyle, your devil fruit ability is clever, and your plan wasn't bad, but it's nowhere near enough. Kyle was left speechless, his cheeks burning. It was the truth, and hearing it so plainly from the future Pirate King hit him hard. He'd thought the boba fruit would make him stand out among his peers, but he hadn't even lasted a single move against Roger. Frustration welled up inside him. Then, beneath it, a sharper, fiercer fighting spirit began to rise. Captain, Kyle blurted out, springing to his feet. Please, teach me how to get stronger. Roger and Rayleigh shared a look of mild surprise. Roger studied Kyle with a curious intensity. A strange light flickered in his deep eyes. He set his toothpick down, grinned, a grin that mixed playfulness with something like approval, and laughed. Koo-ha-ha! Spirited, aren't you? He rose and came up in front of Kyle. Roger's huge, fan-like hand came down hard on Kyle's shoulder, knocking him off balance. All right, Roger said, then pulled his hand back, planted both hands on his hips, and with the air of someone proclaiming a grand decision, announced, Since you're so motivated, starting tomorrow, Rayleigh and I will personally put you through training. Koo-ha-ha! Don't go crying for mercy, little Kyle, and try not to die on us. Roger roared with laughter, as if he'd already imagined the scene of Kyle being pushed to his limits. Kyle swallowed. He stared from Roger's eager, almost gleeful face, one that seemed to hunger for chaos, to Rayleigh's placid, almost sympathetic expression. The look on Rayleigh's face said it all. Good luck. A cold tingle ran up from the base of Kyle's spine to the crown of his head. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. Still, Kyle gritted his teeth and shouted, Yes, Captain! Chapter 9. Tutoring by Famous Teachers. At dawn, before Kyle was fully awake, Rayleigh hoisted him out of his hammock and unceremoniously dumped him on the deck. The cold sea air slapped the last of the sleep from his face. Roger and Rayleigh stood on either side of him like sentries. Roger had his arms folded, and a mischievous grin plastered across his face, enjoying the moment as if it were good theater. Rayleigh, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, looked all business. Before you learn to use your devil fruit more effectively, there's one thing you must understand, Rayleigh said, his voice calm but absolute. The devil fruit gives you power, yes, but something has to carry that power. Your body is the foundation. He nodded toward Roger. This man doesn't have a devil fruit. If you fought him again today, do you really think the result would be different? Kyle glanced at Roger, whose grin showed his gums, and then at the memory of yesterday's blow. The image of that punch still stung. He shook his head without hesitation. Rayleigh's expression softened into something like a smile. So your first training will be in martial arts. This includes improving your physical attributes and your weapon skills. What weapon do you want to use? Kyle had been turning that question over for some time. His boba fruit, in certain respects, was very similar to the tremor fruit, the one wielded by the world's strongest man, the fatherly warlord who took in sons from across the seas, Whitebeard, according to Kyle's memories. In theory, many of the effects produced by the tremor fruit could be replicated by him. I want to use a guandao, Kyle said seriously. Then, seeing the blank look on Roger's face, he added, It's basically a long-handled greatsword, like a polearm with a heavy blade. Roger leaned forward, intrigued. Why that weapon? My power manipulates waves. Really, vibrations, Kyle explained. With a long-handled weapon, I can transmit those vibrations down the shaft into the blade and release them at the moment of impact. That creates a shockwave-like effect. I can strike from a distance but still hit with enormous force. He pictured Whitebeard raising Murakumogiri, the old Titan's stance, and a single strike that seemed to make the very air shiver. He still had a long way to go before reaching that level, but it was undeniably the right direction to head in. I see. A naginata, Roger said, nodding. Good thinking, little Kyle. Using a weapon to amplify your devil fruit powers. Ha! Ha! A flicker of approval showed behind Rayleigh's lenses. This kid had talent, yes, but more important was his judgment, far more valuable than raw strength. Since you've decided, this is your training plan, Rayleigh said. producing a sheet of paper as if from thin air and handing it to Kyle. Kyle took it, and his eyes spasmed uncontrollably. Kyle's exclusive physical enhancement menu: 1. Morning conditioning. Run 100 laps around the ship while wearing weights. Pace is set by the captain's mood. 2. Morning. Seawater resistance training. Tie a rope around your waist and swim in the ship's wake against the current until exhausted. The captain will occasionally throw in obstacles at random, fish, barrels, etc. 3. Afternoon. Weapon fundamentals and combat practice. Instructors: Rayleigh, fundamentals; Roger, combat. 4. Evening. Extreme evasion training. Stand in the center of the deck and dodge the captain and first mate's loving throws. Get hit once and your dinner is halved. Night. Meditation and fine control practice for your devil fruit ability. Kyle stared at the training schedule. Underlined in several places were gems like ship speed determined by captain's mood, randomly deploy obstacles, and the delightfully sadistic, loving throws. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. This plan reeked of chaos and a complete disregard for human dignity, if not human life. He looked up at the ship's rail and muttered, "Is this your doing, incompetent Master Rayleigh?" Roger leaned in, bumped him with an elbow, and grinned in that all-too-pleased way. "What, scared?" Kyle clutched the paper until the edges dug into his palms. His jaw worked. Flames of stubbornness lit his eyes. "No," he said through his teeth. "I accept." So began Kyle's new life. Tragic, crossed out, fulfilling. On the first day, he barely finished 30 laps of the deck when, on a whim, Roger ordered a sudden hard turn. Kyle was flung sideways and skidded face first across 7 or 8 meters of splintered wood before coming to a painful stop. Day 2 was worse. One careless toss from the first mate sent him over the rail and into the salt. He came up choking and sputtering. Gurgle, gurgle. Because, of course, which devil fruit user can swim from the very start? You don't train resistance like this. On the afternoon of the third day, Rayleigh had just finished showing him the basic grips and motions of the Naginata, chop, sweep, lift, thrust, when Roger came running up with his sword in hand. "Come on, little Kyle, time to test what you've learned." How was that different from being taught that 1 + 1 = 2, and then told to go prove Goldback's conjecture? Kyle thought bleakly as steel rang on wood. Clang! 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 He stood on the deck with a makeshift naginata, just a wooden pole crudely lashed to a greatsword, and tried desperately to parry Roger's storm of attacks. Roger wasn't showing off any fancy swordplay. He simply slashed with brutal, straightforward blows. The power behind them numbed the web between Kyle's thumb and forefinger, made his arms ache, and forced him to retreat a step at a time. "Too slow, too soft, there's no power in your blade," Roger barked, each word falling on Kyle like a hammer strike to the chest. Evening evasion drills were worse. "Little Kyle, take this, flying fishtail whip," Roger called, swinging a wide arc. "Kyle, watch the barrel on your right," someone shouted. Kyle leaped and twisted across the deck, dodging and bobbing between attacks like a mouse being toyed with by 2 cats. Sometimes it was a slippery sea fish hurled by Roger, other times a wooden plank launched by Rayleigh, always at weird angles and with deadly speed. Kyle could only trust the razor-sharp 5 senses he'd honed on the deserted island to duck and weave. Then, thump, one caught him. A fish smacked him square on the backside. "Hoo-ha! Hit! Dinner halved!" Roger's mocking laughter rolled across the water. Kyle clutched his sore rear on the verge of tears. A ridiculous, theatrical commentary sprang up in his head without warning. Why did screams of a child echo from that ship? Why was a 6-year-old bruised all over? Was it human depravity or moral collapse? Welcome to the grand documentary, Kyle's Redemption. Of course, none of that was real reporting. It was the kind of melodramatic narration his mind produced automatically while the training ground him down into incoherence. Days of it blurred together. Kyle was exhausted to the point of collapse every night. His bones felt as if they were coming apart, his body a patchwork of bruises, new wounds appearing before the old ones had even scabbed over. More than once, Kyle felt like he was about to die. Every time he pushed himself to the edge, Rayleigh would appear with an ointment to treat his wounds, and Roger would show up with a fragrant roast of a giant sea beast to help him recover his strength. They drove his potential with the harshest methods imaginable, and they looked after him with the most direct care. Slowly, Kyle stopped being totally passive. During the weighted runs, he started instinctively firing off faint shockwaves through his feet to cancel part of the recoil, which made his steps feel lighter. When he sparred with Roger, he stopped meeting force with force. Instead, he learned to run high-frequency vibrations along the shaft of his naginata and detonate them the instant Roger's blade met his, dissipating some of the impact. His handsome face still ended up looking like a swollen pig's snout after a beating, but he could now survive a few extra moves. Jealousy, he told himself. It had to be jealousy of his good looks, and in the evenings, during their so-called loving throws sessions, he squeezed every ounce out of his light illusion mirage, using it to its fullest advantage. By bending the light around him the instant a projectile came near, he could create a brief visual distortion, just a few tenths of a second, but enough to buy time to dodge. As for those seawater resistance drills, better not to bring them up. I mean, what can a devil fruit user even do when they're immersed in seawater? Look at me. Roger and Rayleigh had laughed and then shrugged, completely unfazed. Oh, right. We forgot you're a devil fruit user, they said, half amused, half exasperated. 1 month later, under a low orange sun, Kyle stood shirtless on deck. His bronze skin was etched with thin scars, but his muscles were leaner and firmer than when he'd first arrived. He gripped a makeshift naginata, breathing steady, eyes locked on Roger. "Ready, you bastard captain?" he called. Roger roared with laughter. "Koo-ha-ha! Come at me, little Kyle!" Before Roger finished his sentence, Kyle moved. He slammed his foot down, not to charge, but to drive a shockwave through the deck. Sonic step, instant. The wood shuddered. The reactive force shot him forward, propelling him at a speed several times greater than before. The naginata traced a clean razor arc through the air, a faint white aura humming along the blade's edge. A flicker of surprise crossed Roger's eyes, then his grin broadened. He stayed relaxed, holding his sword in one hand. Without moving out of the way, he met Kyle's strike head-on and drove his blade down. The steel rang, sharp and bright. The clang sent a shockwave of air rippling outward. Kyle was knocked back, skidding across the deck until he left 7 or 8 deep grooves with his boots before he could steady himself. Blood welled at the corner of his mouth, and his chest heaved. For the first time, Roger took a half-step back. It was a small retreat, but the smile on his face was bigger than if he'd unearthed some priceless treasure. He threw his head back and laughed. "Well done, Kyle." Kyle leaned on his naginata, gasping, but an uninhibited smile lit his face, the first and truest he'd shown in over a month. Rayleigh, propped against the mast, allowed himself a small, relieved smile. Chapter 10. The simple life of a pirate knight fell, and the sea grew restless. In the ship's small cabin, Kyle lay sprawled in his hammock. Faint bruises still mottled his face, and bandages wrapped his torso, but the corners of his mouth turned up in a smile even in sleep. In his dream, he stood atop a palace of gold, gripping a black and gold naginata whose blade shimmered with flowing wave patterns. Before him drifted a dense line of marine ships, the admiral standing at their forefront with a grave look. Kyle only needed to swing the naginata. The ocean tore apart like cloth, mountains of water hurled through the void, and the fleet was wiped away. Treasure and beautiful women flooded toward him as he settled on a gilded throne, accepting the kneeling devotion of countless powerful figures. A sudden, arrogant chuckle leaked from his lips, low and strangely fierce in the quiet cabin. Silver's Rayleigh, leaning against the doorway while he cleaned his sword, paused at the sound. He rubbed his forehead with a hand and let out a weary, helpless sigh. Even his dreams couldn't leave him in peace. Quietly, so as not to disturb the sleeping boy, Rayleigh slipped from the cabin and closed the door behind him, leaving Kyle to his grand fantasies. Moonlight ran over the deck like water, pouring across the shimmering sea and scattering little specks of silver. Roger sat alone at the bow, leaning back against the figurehead, and took a long pull from his rum bottle. "Did he bother you?" he asked without turning, a smirk in his voice. "Not really." Rayleigh came up and settled beside him, his sword resting across his lap. "Just some kid laughing himself hoarse." Roger threw back his head and laughed. "Ha! He must have some dream worth laughing about." He drained another swig and turned to Rayleigh. "By the way, you saw that hit this afternoon, didn't you?" Rayleigh pushed his glasses up on his nose. Clever idea. The timing was perfect. More than clever. Roger's eyes glittered with excitement. He pinched his thumb and forefinger together, holding them a hair apart. That power, it made me feel a little threatened. About this much. He laughed again, louder. Behind his lenses, Rayleigh's gaze grew more serious. He considered the moment, then said, "It's not just power. Roger, have you noticed Kyle's performance in the later stages of this month's loving feeding training has been a bit off?" Rayleigh asked. "Oh?" Roger looked up, interested. "Off how?" "At first he relied on his eyes and ears, on instinctive reactions," Rayleigh said, recalling the evening's drills with a touch of curiosity. "But over the last week his evasive moves have gotten unbelievable. Several times the wooden planks I threw and the fish you lobbed from behind him arrived almost at the same moment, yet he always managed to dodge in the most extreme, most energy-efficient way. Could it be?" Roger's smile dimmed for a second. He was quiet, thinking, then suddenly slapped his thigh and erupted into booming laughter. "Kua! So that's it! Observation hockey, huh?" He'd noticed it too, but Roger wasn't one for analysis the way Rayleigh was. He trusted his instincts. Still, he could feel something budding in Kyle, an emerging aura, a fledgling ability that let him glimpse a fraction of the future. Rayleigh glanced toward the cabin, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "That kid probably doesn't even know it yet. It's more fun when he doesn't know. Koo-ha-ha!" Roger finished the last swallow of wine and casually tossed the empty bottle into the dark sea, where it made a small splash. He rose and spread his arms to the breeze, as if embracing the starry ocean itself. Rayleigh watched his forever boisterous captain and couldn't help a soft chuckle. He pushed up his glasses, turned his gaze back to the night sky, and murmured with feeling, "Really, we picked up one hell of a monster! Koo-ha!" Roger's uninhibited laugh carried across the quiet water and startled a few seabirds circling above. Thump! A muffled noise came from below. Kyle had rolled out of his bunk. He grumbled, half asleep, "Damn it, Captain, what's so funny? You woke me right in the middle of a crucial dream. You jerk. Koo-ha-ha-ha!" "My name is Kyle, and I'm a student. In the fan chatter that came with my past life memories, teachers were ranked like this. False master tutoring, Rayleigh, leads students astray. True master tutoring, Koo-ha-ha-ha, 1 strike and you bleed. 2 strikes and you're coated in hockey. 3 strikes and your devil fruit awakens. 4 strikes and you're an emperor in no time." Living it now, that assessment isn't entirely accurate. At least the young Rayleigh is a very good teacher. Kyle clung to Roger and Rayleigh's coattails without an ounce of shame. Being a powerful second generation had its perks. He felt invincible by association and basked in it, leaning back like he'd just won some tactical victory. He half hoped some blind, overeager pirates would try to rob them so he could finally put his training to the test. In reality, the ship they were on was so rotten-looking that any self-respecting pirate would probably end up feeling sorry for them and handing over 100 berries just to get away. No time to mourn the state of the vessel, though. Roger and Rayleigh were nearby, figures so overwhelmingly formidable that even calling them lieutenants felt like underselling them. To anyone who knew the trade, they were Yonko-level threats dropped into a starter town. To the low-ranking grunts around them, it was a completely different league. It was like watching newbie monsters in a beginner zone suddenly come face-to-face with heroes who'd just slain the demon lord. The cannon fodder were outclassed and had nothing to say for themselves. Bang! Roger's deceptively simple punch cut through Kyle's daydreams, and a neat bump rose on his head. "Damn it, Captain! What was that for?" Kyle yelped, clutching his head. He put on a mock sob. "I'm going to report you for child abuse. Koo-ha-ha! Catch me if you can." Roger laughed carelessly and darted off, with Rayleigh's chuckle following him like a second echo. Kyle's eyes were practically spitting fire. He sprang to his feet and darted after him, the two of them, one big, one small, careening madly around the cabin. Rayleigh watched the childish chase and rubbed his forehead helplessly, a wash of fatigue and a sudden sinking dread about the future settling over him. Voyaging was an endless romance, but it was also a long, lonely thing. Kyle had decided that a week ago, staring blankly at the unchanging line where sea met sky. Adventure? Encounters? None of it. Pirate life had been stripped down to its barest form. simple, unadorned, boring. Since they left that nameless island, they had drifted for almost 2 months. Apart from the occasional sea king that treated their battered ship like an after-dinner snack, only to be felled with a single stroke from Roger's sword, days slid by as bland as water. "Great. The ocean's just water," Kyle muttered, as if the monotony could be complained into vanishing. He felt as though he might start sprouting mold from sheer inactivity. Sitting cross-legged on the bow, he idly prodded the surface with one finger. A faint vibration ran along Kyle's fingertip, and as if summoned, a wisp of breeze appeared out of nowhere. It teased the sailcloth on the mast, then playfully mussed the golden hair falling over Rayleigh's forehead. Rayleigh glanced up from his book and gave Kyle a look that clearly said, "Make trouble again and you're skipping dinner." Kyle laughed sheepishly and pulled his hand back. The past month had been mostly hellish physical drills, but he'd spent just as much time learning to precisely control the boba fruit. He'd even invented a little technique he called Breeze at Dawn, which used microscopic air vibrations to generate a steady airflow. In the calm belt, it could act like a makeshift wind for the sails, though, truth be told, most often it served a less noble purpose. "Little Kyle, over here, a bit cooler." Roger lay sprawled on the deck like a sun-dried fish, a huge roasted meat leg clutched in one hand. Kyle rolled his eyes but obliged, waving his hand toward Roger. A refreshing puff of air washed over the sprawled captain. This had become his daily rhythm aboard the ship. Between Roger and Rayleigh's relentless, devilish training, Kyle's body was visibly changing, stronger, tougher, and his control over the boba fruit was growing ever more precise. His strength, speed, and stamina had all shot up. He was getting far better with the boba fruit, too, no longer the greenhorn who only knew one trick, shock punch. He could feel himself growing stronger every day, but he never had a proper outlet for it. Kyle felt like a tempered blade that still needed sharpening, itching for a real fight to test its edge. Dipping beans. Satisfying. He even caught himself savoring small comforts while waiting for something worth fighting for. Daily sparring with Roger, however, wasn't the kind of battle he wanted. It was a one-sided beating. "Ah, I'm so bored," Kyle shouted to the sky and then flopped back onto the deck. "Anything would be fine. Marines, pirates, even a meteor." "Kuaha! The kid's got energy," Roger said, finishing the last bite of meat and casually flinging the bone into the sea. He rose in one swift motion. "Want another round of loving feeding training?" Rayleigh had set his book down at some point and watched. At Roger's words, Kyle shot upright, eyes darting between the two of them. "No, absolutely not," he blurted. The mere sight of seafish or a barrel made him tense. That blasted Roger and his infamous seafish always seemed to end up aimed straight at Kyle's backside. Rayleigh, who had been reading nearby, suddenly spoke up. "You two, guests," he said, his voice calm. Roger and Kyle looked up at the same time. Rayleigh closed the book and set it aside. "Northeast, at 3 o'clock, a 3-masted ship is coming our way. It's moving fast, and that flag, pirates." Chapter 11. First Battle Debut. The word pirates hit Kyle like a bolt of lightning. It felt as if his blood ignited. All his boredom, irritation, and restlessness dissolved into a fierce, rising hunger for a fight. He darted to the rail and squinted in the direction Rayleigh had pointed. Between the blue of sea and sky, a small black speck swelled rapidly. In moments, the dark blot resolved into a ship, its hull many times larger than their shabby little boat. Emblazoned on the sail was a grinning skull with 2 crossed battle axes beneath it, bold and menacing. The pirates had seen them as well. Noisy, arrogant laughter carried over the water, while several crewmen ostentatiously waved weapons and made lewd, provocative gestures. "Kua!" "They came to us like someone bringing a pillow to a sleepy man," Roger crowed, grinning as he flexed his wrists until his knuckles cracked. "My hands are itching." "You damned captain!" A voice cut in. Roger and Rayleigh both turned in surprise. Kyle stood at the rail, the sea breeze ruffling his short black hair, the excitement of the moment bright in his eyes. His eyes flared with an intense, unfamiliar light, like twin flames about to burst forth. "This ship? Leave it to me." He turned to Roger, gaze locked, his right hand already gripping the naginata that leaned against the rail. Roger stared at him for a moment, surprised, then exploded into his signature booming laugh. "Koo-ha!" He strode over and slapped Kyle hard on the shoulder with his big fan-like hand. "Good, I'll leave it to you, little Kyle." Roger drew his hand back, planted both fists on his hips, and smiled with indulgent expectation. "Let's see what 2 months of training have done for you." Then his expression shifted. The smile took on a sly edge. "But if you can't handle it, or if you come back half-beaten, there'll be no dinner for you." "My pleasure," Kyle answered, a confident curve at his mouth. He inhaled deeply, said no more, and turned to face the approaching pirate ship. On its deck, the captain, scarred, hulking as a bear, raised a telescope to his eye. From his perch in the crow's nest, he could see only 3 figures on Roger's ship, 2 grown men and a half-grown boy. He barked a contemptuous laugh that carried across the deck. "Lads, look at that. A wreck of a ship, 2 ragged fools, and that little brat who hasn't even been weaned." He lowered his telescope and bellowed down to his crew. "Today's our lucky day. Kill them and everything on that boat becomes ours." A cheer rose up from the pirates. Kyle braced himself, Naginata in one hand, the other on the rail, and leapt cleanly overboard. "Wave walk!" he shouted. Just as he fell, the sea beneath his feet shimmered and broke into ripples. But instead of spreading outward, the ripples drew inward and hardened into a transparent platform, as if the water had been frozen into glass for his steps. Kyle put down 1 foot and landed as steady as on solid ground. Then a second step, a third. Why not just fly over using recoil, you ask? Move aside. The show's about to start. Kyle strolled across the churning sea as if it were solid earth, long blade in hand, heading straight for their ship. The pirates opposite gaped in astonishment, jaw-dropping, frozen in place. On the deck, Roger watched with obvious delight, repeatedly crying out, "How splendid!" Leaning against the mast, Rayleigh pushed his glasses up and a faint smile tugged at his mouth. He murmured, almost to himself, "The curtain rises." The sea breeze disturbed the young man's short black hair. He gripped a simple naginata and, step by deliberate step, walked across the waves toward the 3-masted vessel. The sight, so utterly impossible, sent the giant axe pirates into chaos. "What is that?" someone shouted. "He's walking on the sea. He must be a devil fruit user." Doubt and fear rippled through the crew. Men backed away, weapons no longer giving them any comfort. That strange, calm approach unnerved them far more than a roaring brute ever could. "What's all the noise?" a rough voice barked, cutting through the commotion. "Shut up, all of you!" The scarred captain shoved a subordinate out of the way and charged to the bow in a few long strides, spitting as he roared. "He's just a devil fruit user. What's there to fear? He's nothing but a baby who still needs his bottle." He stared down at Kyle, who walked toward them at an easy pace, contempt written all over the captain's face. "Hey, kid," he taunted. "This isn't your backyard pool. Why don't you toddle home to Mama for your milk?" His laughter was loud and mean, and it caught the crew like wildfire. Men who had been shaken moments before now jeered openly. Emboldened by their captain's ridicule, they returned to bravado. With a wide, sinister grin, the captain barked, "Cannons, shift 5 millimeters to the left. Fire! Blow him to pieces!" Boom, boom, boom. 3 cannons belched black smoke and shrieked as iron shot screamed through the air toward Kyle. On deck, Roger and Rayleigh watched with complete calm. Roger even crossed his arms and grinned, clearly ready to enjoy the spectacle. And as the whistling cannonballs cut across the water, Kyle did nothing. He didn't dodge, didn't flinch. He simply kept walking. He bent his knees barely like a coil tightening. Sonic step, instant! The water under his feet plunged away, and an invisible shockwave detonated from his soles. The force threw Kyle straight up, launching him over 10 meters in a heartbeat. The giant axe captain's smug grin froze. High in the air, Kyle's body stretched. The cold steel of his naginata flashed a thin arc in the sunlight. He didn't rely on flashy showmanship. He funneled everything he'd honed over the last 2 months into that single sweep. He cast the slash toward the oncoming volley of cannonballs. A ribbon of condensed white energy peeled off the blade. It seemed to separate after the cannonballs had already been fired, but it outran them and struck first, hitting the central shot dead on. Boom! The struck cannonball crumpled as if gripped by an invisible hand, and the force shattered the neighboring cannonballs in a chain reaction. Iron fragments spattered the sky. Smoke and salt spray billowed, swallowing that patch of sea. How is that possible?" a pirate stammered. Then, through the churning mist and smoke, Kyle stepped back into view. He hung in midair and slowly lifted his head. His golden eyes burned with lethal intent. "Game over," he said. Kyle held the naginata out horizontally. The blade began to hum as he poured his power to control waves into it without reservation. The air around the edge warped violently and emitted high, keening screams. "Listen closely. This is for you, a requiem." Bracing, he tightened both hands on the hilt and drew himself back, that gathering every ounce of strength into a single strike. "Onigiri, Baku homing," he shouted. He swung. For an instant time seemed to hang frozen. From the naginata's blade erupted a visible phoenix-shaped shockwave, an enormous pulse of compressed sound and air. Wherever it passed, the atmosphere itself seemed to cry out, tearing with spiderweb cracks as if glass had been shattered. The phoenix screamed, a razor note that could split clouds and stone. With a beat of its wings, it spanned 100 meters of sea and slammed precisely into the center of the giant Axe Pirate Group's three-masted ship. The impact detonated with earth-shattering force. A deafening roar burst outward, as if the sky itself had been rent in two. The giant Axe Pirate Group's proud sailing ship looked as if a giant's iron fist had struck it squarely. A massive dent blossomed in the thick center of the hull, and a web of splintering cracks raced outward from the impact. In the next heartbeat, the whole vessel tore itself apart with a thunderous crash. Wood splinters and torn canvas flew in every direction, masts snapped like twigs, and a shockwave hurled dozens of pirates into the air. Their screams cut through the chaos as they fell into the sea, like dumplings dropped into a boiling pot. The captain, who had been ensnaring a second before, stood frozen with wide, unbelieving eyes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could only watch helplessly as his ship collapsed around him. A flying plank struck him, and then he sank beneath the wreckage into the dark water. In minutes, a fully armed pirate ship and its crew had been utterly annihilated by Kyle's earth-shattering strike. On the sea, only floating timbers and torn sails remained, accompanied by the distant, despairing wails of the survivors. Kyle stood on the waves, leaning on his naginata. His chest heaved, but a fierce, new exhilaration welled up from deep inside him. Act fast. Look cool. Shout the name of your move. This is the fire of youth. Coo! Coo-ah! There was a beat of silence on Roger's ship, then Roger's booming laughter exploded across the deck. He bent double, laughing so hard he nearly cried, and thumped Rayleigh on the back as he guffawed. "Did you see that? Rayleigh, did you see that? Coo-ha! Well done, Kyle." Rayleigh gently shrugged Roger off, pushed his glasses back up his nose, and watched with relief and approval shining behind the lenses. 12. A bleak future. What an entrance, what power, what spectacle. Perfect. I, Kale, would call it the ultimate show-off. I wondered if any world government newsbirds had seen me. Would my first fight be recorded? Would I get my own wanted poster? Aaron Kale, bounty. It should start at least 1,000,000 berries. I stroked my chin, already picturing the photo, preferably the one of me walking on the waves just now. I was lost in that glorious daydream of becoming famous across the seas when Roger's booming voice cut through from the ship. "Coo-ha! Kale! Well done! Come back! Time for a banquet!" I grinned, still hungry for more. The water beneath my feet rippled as I pushed off and leapt lightly back onto the deck. Night had fallen. The bonfire crackled, throwing warm light across the three of us. Fat slabs of meat hissed and browned on the spit, the smell drifting over the deck. Roger and Rayleigh raised their cups and clinked them together with a dull thunk. "To our future great pirate, Kale's first successful battle. Cheers!" Roger roared, laughing as he downed his rum. Kale lifted his wooden cup eagerly, ready to clink it with the others, then felt a hand stop him. Rayleigh had subtly intercepted his arm. When Kale looked down, his cup held not rum but orange juice, its sweet scent rising up. "Miners don't drink alcohol," Rayleigh said, cool and firm as he pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. Kale's grin froze. "But, coo-ha! Kids should drink juice!" Roger roared, refilling Kale's cup with obvious glee. Humiliated, Kale gulped the orange juice in one angry swallow, grumbling silently to himself. "Chech, orange juice is fine, actually. Good for scurvy, even." After 3 rounds of drinks and 5 courses of roasted meat, Kale was stuffed. He flopped onto a wooden crate, patted his rounded belly, and let out a loud, satisfied burp. He stared out at the broken hulks bobbing in the distance, and a sudden, serious thought crossed his face. "Damn, Captain," he mumbled weakly. "It looks like we lost out." Roger, who had been drinking straight from a wine barrel, looked over in confusion. Kale's expression turned pained. "I smashed their ships," he said. "All the berries, the treasure, the food on board. Didn't it all sink with them? We worked half a day and got nothing." Roger paused with a toothpick in his mouth, then, as if a light bulb suddenly went off, slapped his thigh. "You're right." Rayleigh, sitting next to him, gave a helpless sigh. Those two always had such eccentric ways of thinking. Roger threw his head back in a booming laugh. "Kuha! Little Kale, you've got good ideas." His face flushed from drink as he jumped to his feet and planted himself in front of Kale. "But money's the least of it. You did well today, but there's plenty of room to improve." He wiggled a finger in front of Kale. "Your attack is flashy, but the power isn't focused enough. If you can fix that, your strength could double." Kale was a bit slow to catch on. "Hockey? Hockey?" Roger grinned like someone amused that Kale didn't already know. "Come on, I'll teach you now. I'll show you what real power looks like." Kale practically sprang to his feet, eyes bright. Armament hockey, the mark of the strong in the New World. Rayleigh watched Roger's drunken excitement and peered over his glasses with a look that clearly said, "Be careful." Someone opened his mouth as if to protest, then sighed and stepped back, wisely keeping his distance from the teaching site. "Watch closely, little Kale." Roger dropped into a horse stance, drew a deep breath, and clenched his right fist. "Armament hockey. It looks like this." Instantly his fist was sheathed in a glossy, lacquer-black metallic sheen. With a grunt, he slammed it into the ship's hull. Wood splintered with a sickening crack, and for a heartbeat everything seemed to freeze. Roger's fist had punched clean through the plank. A jagged hole gaped in the hull, and cold seawater roared into the cabin. The mood on deck went ice cold. Roger withdrew his hand, stared down at the hole, spouting water, then at his own fist. The drunken haze that had blurred his features seemed to clear by half. His face went blank. Kale's eager excitement turned to stone and then shattered. Kale's pupils pinched down, and his mouth fell open in a grotesque O. His whole face twisted like a figure out of Munch's The Scream. A second later, a raw, panicked shout tore through the night. "You damned captain! Ah!" Kale scrambled across the slick deck to the jagged breach and stared at the seawater gushing in. Panic cooled his blood. "The ship's going to sink! We're done for!" He slapped his hands against the hole, trying to stop the inflow, but the rush of water was too strong. His palms slid, useless against the current. "Aha! It was just an accident." Roger choked out, awkwardly scratching the back of his head and trying to explain. "Accident?" Kale almost screamed. He wheeled on him. "Who told you to use your own ship as a demonstration?" More seawater poured through the opening. Then an idea struck. Kale slammed his hands onto the planks around the breach. Boba fruit ability. Activate. "Back! Hold it for me." He pushed a high-frequency vibration through the hull. The boards around the broken section began to shudder violently, visibly trembling as the waves radiated outward. The incoming tide was driven outward by that force, heaving up into a temporary wall of water that kept the cabin from filling. Kale cupped his hands and guided the backflow, turning the rushing sea into a narrow jet that blasted straight back out through the gash in the hull. He was soaked, gasping for breath and sweating through his shirt, but the danger wasn't over. The hole was still there. "Hey, Rayleigh, stop watching the show and find something to patch the ship." Kale barked at the man who had retreated up to the mast. Rayleigh only sighed, set his wine glass down, and with an expression that said, "I told you so," reluctantly started rummaging the deck for planks and tools. Roger, the one who'd caused the damage, had recovered from his initial surprise, and seeing Kale's frantic face, lost it. He doubled over in thunderous laughter. "Koo-ha, little Kale, you were priceless just now." "Laugh all you want. Aren't you going to help?" Kale shot back. Between the three of them, clumsy and wet, they managed to nail a few boards over the breach. It was barely enough. When it was done, Kale collapsed onto the slick deck like a dead fish, staring up at the indifferent stars and feeling nothing but a hollow, bleak future. Is it still possible to get off the ship now? Chapter 13. The sorrows and joys of people are not the same. The meeting room at Marine G5 felt as heavy as the air before a storm. A Den Mushi projection faithfully painted an image across one wall. From the swirling smoke and mist stepped a young figure. The naginata in his hand flashed like lightning. He shouted, "Onigiri! Baku homing!" A roar that seemed to tear right through the projection accompanied the shout. A massive, phoenix-shaped shockwave erupted and struck a three-masted ship dead center. In the silent replay, the sturdy hull splintered and collapsed, wood and bodies thrown everywhere. A file bag slammed down onto the conference table with a heavy thud. Branch Captain Brian went pale, his thick fingers digging into the wood as if to anchor himself. "The giant axe pirates," he said, voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "Their captain's bounty is 600,000 berries, and the total bounty for the whole crew is over 1 million. His words echoed through the room, leaving a pressure even the projection couldn't dispel. Now then, who can explain how an unknown kid alone wiped them out in minutes? Captain Brian barked. No one answered. The officers in the room stared at the frozen image projected on the wall, a young man with a defiant look on his face at the exact moment he unleashed whatever attack had leveled the pirate ship. The sight made their chests tighten. "Captain," an intelligence officer said hoarsely, "based on survivor testimony and analysis of the footage, the attacker is a devil fruit user. Preliminary assessment, a paramecia type that manipulates shock waves or sound waves, or possibly an unusual logia with similar properties." "I don't care what type he is," Brian snapped. "All I know is that a newcomer, with a single strike, destroyed an armed pirate vessel. That level of destructive power, if it isn't contained, will be a massive threat to us down the line." The room erupted into tense debate. Officers exchanged worried looks as plans and precautions began to be argued at once, the projections on the wall a grim reminder of what they were now up against. "His method of appearing is strange, walking on the sea. That's not an ordinary power," the bespectacled rear admiral said, his voice flat and precise. "His attack reaches over 100 meters, and it's instantaneous. This kid's devil fruit is extremely well developed." A hush fell over the conference room. When the admiral added, "What's most disturbing is that he showed up aboard Gol D. Roger and Silver's Rayleigh's ship," the silence snapped into full attention. Roger and Rayleigh were names that still carried weight on the Grand Line. They rarely surfaced, but when they did, the world took notice. The idea that this unknown fighter was associated with them sent a chill through the room. Captain Brian's expression hardened. He sat in silence for a long moment, then picked up a pen and scrawled a few lines across a blank bounty poster draft. "Draft a wanted poster," he ordered. "Distribute it immediately to every branch and every news agency. The whole world must know about this dangerous kid." Within days, a fresh bounty poster was winging its way across the Grand Line on the backs of newsbirds, plastered in ports and taverns from one end of the sea to the other. The wanted poster showed a black-haired young man frozen in mid-leap, naginata extended in a perfect arc. Sea spray teased his short hair, and his golden eyes held no hint of fear, only a fierce, burning defiance that seemed ready to incinerate everything in its path. It was precisely the expression he'd worn while unleashing Onigiri Baku homing, an image snatched by a distant Den Mushi. "Wanted dead or alive. Iron Kyle. Bounty, 1,500,000 berries." "Kuahaha! Finally land! Supplies! Party!" Roger shouted, planting a foot on solid ground and flinging his arms wide. The ship behind him looked like it had been through a war, scorched deck, patched hull, sails mended on the fly. Roger had even punched a hole in it himself at one point. Only the tireless work of Rayleigh and Kyle had kept the battered vessel afloat long enough to limp into the next port. This island was a busy commercial hub. Boats tacked into the harbor, merchants called out their wares, and people moved along the docks in a steady stream. "I'm getting rum and meat," Roger declared and sprinted for the town center. Rayleigh adjusted his glasses, smiled faintly, and headed toward a shop on the other side to check nautical charts and pick up everyday supplies. Kyle glanced left and right, then fixed his gaze on a small stall piled with newspapers and wanted posters. He'd only wandered over out of curiosity to see which new celebrities had popped up on the Grand Line lately. He let his eyes roam over the rows of faces tacked to the wall. Most were forgettable, ordinary bounties and ordinary criminals. He was about to walk away when a brand new poster, the ink still almost wet, caught his attention. The face on it felt strangely familiar. Kyle leaned in. When he saw the photo clearly, his pupils shrank. The young man in the picture had black hair, gold eyes, a defiant expression, and was caught mid-swing, blade arcing in a ridiculously handsome pose. Who is this guy, he thought. He's so damn good-looking. Wait, Kyle's heart started pounding. He tore the wanted poster free from the wall and stared at the printed name, Iron Kyle. The bounty amount was just a blur of zeros. A grin spread across his face before he could stop it. Not bad, he said to himself, rubbing his chin. He couldn't help putting on a show in his head. They really captured it, the defiant, kingly look, that arrogant, world-looking down-on-you aura. He felt absurdly pleased, as if the poster had validated everything he'd always known about himself. He grinned. The only problem, he thought, was that the photo had been chosen far too well. What if lovesick maidens saw it and chased after him every day? A daily occurrence for you, dear readers. Ah, being handsome really was a kind of trouble. He lingered over his own handsome face with obvious pleasure, then his eyes dropped to the bounty. 1,500,000 berries. The smile disappeared in an instant. 1,500,000? Only 1,500,000. He fumed inwardly. Are you kidding me? Who do they think they're insulting? My world-shattering Baku-homing alone should be worth more than that just for the spectacle. And my peerless look as I stride across the waves, not even one berry for style? Should the Marine's bounty assessment department be replaced? Before he could stew any longer, a nearby vendor began hanging up a fresh row of wanted posters. Kyle glanced casually at them. Bounty, 15,500 berries. In the photo, Roger grinned wide, laughing like the village idiot next door. Kyle shifted his gaze to the next poster. Dead or alive, Silver's Rayleigh bounty, 13,000 berries. The wanted poster showed Rayleigh leaning against the ship's rail, his face calm and composed, the light catching on his glasses. Kyle stood silent, staring at the modest 1,500,000 bounty poster in his hand. Then he glanced up at the other two posters tacked nearby, both of them over 10 million. Suddenly, the paper in his hand felt embarrassingly small. He reminded himself that Rayleigh and Roger were only in their 20s, that their pirate crew had only just been formed, and that there was no inflation in this era. The scale of those bounties was terrifying. Koo-ha-ha-ha! Kyle! What are you gawking at? You look like you're about to fall over. Roger's booming voice came from behind. He strode up carrying a couple of rum barrels under one arm and a huge slab of raw meat in the other. When he saw the poster Kyle was holding, his eyes lit up. Oh ho, this is yours, isn't it? Roger snatched it away, held it up to his face, and laughed heartily. Not bad, Kyle. You've already got a wanted poster. 1,500,000. Amazing. Rayleigh came over as well. When he saw the wanted poster, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he pushed his glasses up. Looks like the Marines noticed your first fight, he said. Kyle glanced at his two guardians with a proud parental look. Our kid did good, then at their absurdly high bounties. A chilly gust of what could only be called disparity ran through him. He pouted and muttered, Big deal. It's only one more zero than mine. People's joys and sorrows rarely line up. 14. Famous Teacher Tutoring, Domineering Edition. 3 days after they set sail, Kyle was still stewing over his bounty. He carefully wiped the crude naginata with a deerskin cloth, muttering to himself, 1.5 million, 1.5 million, I'm worth less than a coastal sea king. Do those Marines think my Phoenix Blast is some rented special effect? They've got no sense of aesthetics. Blind. Still fussing about that? Rayleigh asked from beside him. He was propped against the mast with a book in hand, though his eyes were clearly not on the pages. I'm not, Kyle blurted, then deflated a moment later. I just feel my worth and my handsomeness are horribly mismatched. Koo-ha-ha! So how much do you reckon you're worth? Roger called, coming out of the galley with a huge fishbone over his shoulder. He must have just finished breakfast. Kyle puffed out his chest and held up 3 fingers. Starting price, 30 million berries. Roger and Rayleigh exchanged a look and burst out laughing. Roger's laughter was loud and unrestrained. Rayleigh's was softer, a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "Kid, you've got big ambitions." Rayleigh closed his book, pushed his glasses up, and his expression grew a shade more serious. "But a bounty is only the world government's estimate of how dangerous you are. It doesn't tell the whole story. That strike of yours was flashy, and it's strong enough to put off ordinary pirates." He changed the subject, his voice sharpening. "If you run into a true powerhouse, though, you could be dead before you swing that sword. In fact, your proud little shockwave might not even be able to touch some kinds of strength." Kyle stopped wiping his naginata and frowned. "Some kinds of strength?" "Hockey." Rayleigh said the word plainly, and for a moment the air on the deck seemed to thicken. All people have a hidden power inside them. Call it aura, presence, intimidation. It's inborn, but most folks don't know it exists or can't bring it out. Hockey is that power. It's generally divided into 3 types. He held up a finger. First is observation hockey, the ability to keenly sense the auras around you. It lets you detect foes outside your field of vision and even anticipate what they're going to do next. In fact, during your last love-feeding training, you unconsciously grazed its threshold. Kyle felt his chest tighten. He could still picture the impossible dodges Rayleigh had described him making in the later stages of that training. Rayleigh raised a second finger and continued. "The other is armament hockey. Roger showed it a few days ago. It boosts both offense and defense, like wearing invisible armor. More importantly, it's the most reliable way to fight devil fruit users. Whether Logia or Paramecia, against strong armament hockey, a devil fruit's advantage can vanish." Kyle's pupils narrowed. He'd known, from his previous life, how crucial hockey was. Hearing it explained now by the future Pluton Rayleigh, though, made the pressure feel different, far more immediate. One couldn't help but think Oda, that crafty old bastard, hadn't made things simple when he introduced hockey. It ended up overshadowing everything. A lot of earlier characters had been left at a disadvantage simply because they'd appeared before hockey became part of the world. As for the third type, Rayleigh paused and glanced at the grinning, simple-minded Roger beside him. "That's Hao Shoku, Conqueror's hockey. Only about 1 in a million people are born with it. It's a king's instinct. You can't learn it later, and it can only be awakened from within, so you don't need to worry about that for now." "Ku-ha-ha! Got it, little Kyle!" Roger boomed, flinging a fishbone into the sea. He planted himself in front of Kyle, hands on his hips, his shadow towering over the boy like a mountain. "Want to add another 0 to your bounty? Then first learn how to take a beating." Before Kyle could answer, Roger's large hand produced a strip of black cloth as if from nowhere. "Here, put this on." "What's this for?" Kyle said, staring at the sweat-scented strip with a grimace. "To train your observation hockey," Roger said, not giving him a chance to object, and promptly tied the cloth over Kyle's eyes. "If your eyes and ears betray you, then don't use them. Use your heart to see, to hear." Darkness closed around him instantly, and Kyle's sense of safety vanished. Hey, you damn captain, don't mess around." "Ku-ha-ha!" Roger laughed, delighted. "Rayleigh, you ready?" "Anytime." Kyle's sixth sense screamed in alarm. He could feel something hurtling in from both sides, the hiss of rushing air in his ears. Sneak attack. Instinctively, he threw himself backwards, just in time to see a splintered plank and a wine bottle whoosh past, barely missing his face. "Oh?" Rayleigh's voice held a surprised note. "Not bad." Roger laughed, excited. "Then let's up the dose." Kyle had barely straightened and taken a breath when the deck erupted with the sound of things slicing through the air, raining down from every direction. Hey, that's not fair," he protested, scrambling to dodge with nothing but that vague premonition to guide him. He ducked and wove clumsily, but a heavy blow cracked into his back, an anchor fragment Roger had hurled, knocking the wind out of him like a sledgehammer. Before he could recover, something smacked his forehead and bounced off, an apple from Rayleigh. "You idiots! Are you trying to kill me?" Kyle wailed, clutching his head. "Ku-ha!" Roger's laughter rolled across the deck, matched by Rayleigh's chuckle as Kyle glared at them both. "If you can die from something like that, how could you be my crewmate?" Roger laughed, the sound edged with malice. "Focus, Kyle," Rayleigh said calmly, like an outside observer. Don't use your ears to locate sounds, don't use your skin to feel shifts in the air, and don't rely on your devil fruit power. You have to sense their intent to attack. That intent shows itself as an aura. It can't be hidden. Intent? Aura? Kyle clenched his teeth in the dark and forced himself to quiet his racing thoughts. He stopped every unnecessary movement and froze like a stake driven into the deck, letting his mind reach outward. The rustle of pages as Rayleigh turned them, the hiss of wind, the slap of waves, Roger's slow breath, none of those were it. What he needed was a single, directed hostility, the unmistakable urge to kill. There, back right. Kyle felt it, pinpointed it, and without hesitation stepped forward and to his left. A wooden board slammed into the air where he had just stood and exploded into splinters. Very good, Rayleigh approved. Relief flickered through Kyle, but he forced himself to stay tense. There was no room to relax. He felt killing intent flare up all around him, little sparks in the dark, sharp and deadly. Left side, 2. Front, 3. And 1 above his head. Kyle inhaled, and his body twisted in ways ordinary people couldn't follow. He moved like a strip of kelp in a strong current, slipping and bending with the smallest shifts and the most extreme angles to dodge each incoming strike by the slimmest margin. When the last orange nicked his ear and dropped to the deck with a soft splat, the barrage stopped. Kyle was breathing hard and soaked in sweat, but he couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. He yanked off the blindfold and looked at the ruined deck, smashed fruit and splatter everywhere, and at Roger and Rayleigh standing nearby, one holding a barrel, the other a book, both eyes shining with excitement. Again, he shouted. The feeling was intoxicating. The observation hockey training wore on through the entire morning, and only ended when Kyle was so exhausted he could barely stand. Just as he thought he might finally rest that afternoon, Rayleigh switched gears. Armament hockey, Rayleigh began, adopting his role as the theoretical instructor, is simply the materialization of your presence, a coating of intent that can cover your body or your weapon. It comes from the strength of your spirit and body. You use your will to gather and condense it. Think of your body as a sword and hockey as an invisible sheath. It protects the blade and makes your strikes sharper. Enough talk, Roger cut him off, clenching his fist until it snapped. Practice is the only proof. Come on, little Kyle, hit me here. He tapped his arm, which was sheathed in a glossy, pitch-black layer of armament hockey. Kyle stared. The arm looked harder than steel, and his mouth twitched. No way. That'll break my hand, he blurted. Koo-ha-ha! Fine! Then it's my turn! Roger grinned and lunged, throwing a punch. Kyle reacted instinctively, holding his practiced naginata horizontally across his chest to block. Clang! A deafening crash. The force poured through the blade like a battering ram. Kyle's whole body ripped backward and flew more than 10 meters, smashing through the wooden door of the ship's cabin. He tasted blood, coughed, and spat it out. The skin between Kyle's thumb and forefinger on both hands had been ripped open, the webbing hanging shredded and bleeding where he still gripped the naginata. Even the shaft of the otherwise sturdy polearm had a clean, telling crack down its length. Roger pulled his fist back and stood there smiling. You feel that? He asked. Your shockwave can tear a ship apart, but it couldn't even push me off my feet. Kyle crawled out of the wreckage, spitting a mouthful of frothy blood. His eyes were unnaturally bright. Are you trying to kill me, you bastard? Again, he demanded. That's the spirit, Roger said, almost approvingly. For the next hour, the deck turned into a relentless onslaught. It was a one-sided beating. Roger never went full out, but every strike was timed and placed to make Kyle taste hockey, to make him feel it sinking through his guard and slamming into his body. Each blow carried that internal crushing pressure rather than raw speed. At one point, Rayleigh, who had quietly drawn his sword, coated the blade with armament hockey. He made no show of it. He simply thrust the tip forward in an unassuming motion. The sword didn't move fast, but the effect was immediate. The hairs on Kyle's arms rose as if in warning. The edge felt impossibly keen, as though it could cut through anything that stood in its path. Kyle's pupils narrowed. It was too late to dodge. He poured every scrap of spirit and will into the naginata, copying Rayleigh, visualizing and condensing that invisible armor. Harden for me, damn it! He shouted, and slammed the weapon up to meet the tip of Rayleigh's sword. a sharp, almost otherworldly ring as metal met metal. Sparks flew. The naginata didn't shatter. A few new cracks spidered across the blade, but it had held Rayleigh's strike. Kyle stared, stunned. He glanced from his weapon to Rayleigh, who remained calm. Rayleigh withdrew his sword and said slowly, "In that instant, you succeeded. Your will, although faint, did cover the weapon." The blade hummed in Kyle's hands, and a strange sensation ran through his arms, as if he'd fused with the naginata. His heart pounded. "This is armament hockey? Ha ha ha! Well done, Kyle," Roger bellowed, then slapped him across the back so hard it almost made him spit blood. Kyle staggered, but managed a grin, a raw, ugly thing that was half pain and half triumph. At that moment, every muscle ached, and his bones felt as if they were coming apart. Yet a startling rush of satisfaction and exhilaration rose up from deep within him. 15. The King's Right Wrist. The after-effects of hockey training ran through Kyle like a fever. Every bone felt as if Roger and Rayleigh had taken it apart and glued it back together with little care, ready to come apart at the first wrong move. When their rickety boat finally nosed onto the shore of a seemingly deserted island, Kyle almost dragged himself ashore, face down in the sand, one arm stretched out ahead of him. "Captain, don't stop," he croaked, voice thin with exhaustion. "Hoo-ha! Adventure! Adventure!" Roger exploded the moment his boots hit solid ground. The captain became something untamed, eyes lighting up like a dog let off its leash. He uttered a wild, incomprehensible cheer and charged straight into the primeval jungle, gone in an instant. It was so like Roger. Isn't he worried about venomous snakes and ferocious beasts in there? Kyle grumbled weakly, trying to push himself up and brushing sand from his clothes. Rayleigh dropped from the ship and landed lightly at Kyle's side. "He probably looks forward to those things," he said. "He said he felt something interesting here." "Something interesting?" Kyle rolled his eyes. He struggled to sit up all the way and rubbed grit from his palm. "I think he's just bored and needs something to break." Rayleigh didn't answer. He walked slowly along the shoreline, watching the island's plants and the pull of the tides. Kyle fell in step behind him, stretching his stiff muscles and glancing around. The place felt primeval, massive trees blotting out the sun, the ground alive with undergrowth, the air heavy with the clean, green smell of earth and leaves. "By the way, Rayleigh," Kyle said, kicking a pebble ahead of him, "how did you and that scoundrel Roger meet?" Rayleigh pushed his glasses up and stared toward the distant horizon, a quiet expression settling over his face as if he were replaying an old memory. "My house burned down," he said slowly. "I was living on a boat." Then, almost as if he could hear the voice again, the memory answered him with a laugh. "I am Gol D, Roger, and our meeting is fated, Rayleigh. Will you come with me to turn this world upside down?" Kyle stroked his chin, more amused than impressed. He wasn't thinking about legend or fate. "So you stole a boat, then? You didn't happen to steal Roger's boat, did you? Or did Roger set your house on fire?" Rayleigh said nothing. He only stood very still, the brief smile dying at the corners of his mouth. A moment later, a sound ripped across the island, a low, bone-shaking roar from the very center of the land. The ground shuddered beneath their feet as if something enormous was rolling beneath the earth. In the distance, hundreds of birds shrieked and scattered. A massive cloud of dust rose into the sky, punctuated by the sharp snaps of breaking wood. Kyle and Rayleigh exchanged a look, the same thought already clear in both their eyes. "I knew it," Kyle muttered, rubbing his forehead, resignation written on his face. Rayleigh sighed, but the expression behind his glasses sharpened. "Let's go. Let's see what trouble Roger's gotten himself into this time." They didn't waste another second. In an instant, they blurred into motion and streaked toward the commotion. When they reached the center of the island, they stopped dead. The dense jungle that had stood there a moment before was gone, replaced by a chaotic clearing. The earth was crisscrossed with deep slash marks and dotted with enormous craters. Trees lay broken and smoking, their trunks shattered like matchsticks. At the heart of the clearing, two figures were locked in a violent, storm-like clash. Roger stood laughing in the middle of it all, a long sword in his hand. "Kuha! Excellent! Truly excellent!" he cried, every swing powerful enough to cleave mountains and shatter rock. Across from him stood a tall young man, about Roger's age, his long hair tied back. He met Roger blow for blow, the two of them turning the jungle into a battlefield with the sheer force of their fight. The young man swung two massive battle-Zs with a brutal, open style, wild, raw power behind every strike. The plain, uncompromising great axes flashed through the air. Each time axe met blade, there was a blinding shower of sparks, and a metallic roar so loud the shockwave scraped a layer off the arena floor. Kyle's pupils pinched to slits. Two axes, a towering silhouette, black sunglasses, and that indomitable, savage fighting spirit. He could hardly believe it. The legendary cave explorer, proof that even a kid from a trade school could make it to the top of the world. The strongest man around. The future number 3 of the Roger Pirates, the bronze of the legendary gold, silver, and bronze trio. Scopper Jabba, Kyle breathed, inwardly stunned. Across the arena, Roger, who'd been watching the brawl, caught sight of the newcomers. "Oh, you're here," he said with a grin, and in an instant his whole expression changed. The playful light in his eyes vanished. Roger's posture shifted. The easy joy he'd been radiating dissolved, and like a dam breaking, a supreme pressure exploded outward from him, an authority that seemed to command the very air. The roar of that presence rolled over the crowd and fighters alike, and the ground itself trembled beneath it. No longer a man simply enjoying a fight, Roger now carried the weight of something far greater. Kyle felt it like a physical thing. The room pressed inward, and every breath tightened. The battle had just become a different kind of contest. Black and red, lightning-like energy began to coil furiously around Jabba's axes, hissing and sizzling. His face snapped into something hard and cold. The aura he was giving off now was completely different from before, but he did not back down. With a roar, he poured every ounce of strength into his twin axes and charged at Roger. "Good eyes," Roger called, a laugh in his voice as he raised his long sword. He locked his focus on Jabba's approach. "Got avoidance." There were no flashy effects, no wasted flourish, just a single, clean horizontal slash. The cut, laced with Conqueror's haki, seemed to ignore ordinary distance. It cleaved through the space between them and met Jabba's crossed axes exactly where they blocked. For a heartbeat, time itself felt suspended. Before Jabba's astonishment could fade, an irresistible, incomprehensible force streamed through the axe blades and into him. The metal cried out. Crack! Spiderweb fractures radiated across the blades as they shuddered under the pressure. The strike hit like a freight train. Jabba's head snapped back, his eyes rolled, blood spurted from his mouth, and he was hurled through the clearing, smashing 7 or 8 huge trees on the way, before he finally came to rest and slumped unconscious. One blow, a clean, decisive victory. Silence dropped over the glade. Roger stood alone, sword propped on his shoulder, grinning. Kyle swallowed hard, stars in his eyes. Was that Conqueror's haki coating his blade? "Master, teach me that. This god avoidance is amazing. I have to learn it." Roger strolled over to the fallen Jabba, but didn't finish him off. Instead, he crouched, studying the man with obvious interest, then glanced down at Jabba's 2 battle axes, already spiderwebbed with cracks from the impact. "Ka! What an interesting fellow," he rumbled, as if he'd forgotten he'd been the one to strike him. Turning to Rayleigh and Kyle, he called out, "Hey, wake him up! I have something to ask him." About 10 minutes later, a small shockwave from Kyle roused Jabba. He propped himself against a tree, wary and blinking, and looked up at the 3 strange figures standing over him. "You're strong." Roger crouched down in front of him, offering a waterskin with a wide, open smile. "I'm Gol D, Roger. These are Rayleigh and Kyle. What's your name? Do you have a dream?" Jabba, taken aback by the unexpected kindness, hesitated a moment before taking the waterskin. He drank a few long gulps, then answered in a low voice, "Scopper Jabba, my dream is to sail the world, to see every sight on these great seas with hush my own eyes, and then marry a big woman." Roger's eyes lit up. He slapped his thigh and sprang to his feet, excitement written all over his face. "Sail the world? That's a fine dream. I approve of you." Kyle chuckled and added, teasingly, "Shouldn't we put more emphasis on that second part?" Roger stepped forward, extending his hand with a grin bright enough to cut through the trees. "Jabba, come aboard my ship. Let's go and turn this world upside down together." Jabba stared into Roger's clear, honest eyes and felt the contagious confidence in the man's presence. For a long beat he was dumbstruck, Then, relief and a broad smile replaced his tension, and he nodded eagerly. All right. Kyle watched the scene unfold and felt his inner commentary catching fire. That was it? A little fight, one question about a dream, and a casual, I approve of you, and suddenly an SSR-level recruit was willingly boarding their ship? He could barely believe it. The legendary succubus Roger was positively steaming, and yet there she was, chatting away with Jabba like nothing had happened. Rayleigh stood nearby with that expression of his, the one that said, I've seen this all before, and Kyle couldn't help but feel like the whole thing was a rehearsed show. No offense meant, but Rayleigh was the Pirate King's right hand, and Jabba his left. So what did that leave me? Chapter 16, Dream. There was a simple law among pirates. The faster they recovered, the hungrier they were for destruction, and the more reasons they found to celebrate, the less they seemed to care about any moral line. One moment, the beach had been a life-or-death battlefield. The next, it had become a drunken party, with arms slung over shoulders and voices raised in song. A huge bonfire crackled on the sand, roasting an enormous creature that Roger had cleaved in two with a single stroke. Grease hissed as it dripped into the flames, and the air filled with the rich, smoky smell of cooking meat. Kyle sat propped against a boulder that had been flattened by a shockwave, a wooden bowl in his hands, feeling like a ragged thing washed up by some merciless tide. His bones argued with one another, every muscle protesting the day's abuse. I say, can't we at least wait until the ship's fixed, or until I'm back on my feet, before throwing a feast? He muttered, voice thin. Do we have to have a banquet in the middle of nowhere? Hoo-ha! Whiners! Roger bellowed, laughter rumbling like thunder. He hefted a massive leg of the roasted beast in his left hand, and had his right arm slung around the shoulder of Jabba, the newest recruit. Both of them were flushed with drink, their faces bright with the glow of the fire. Around them, the crew laughed and argued, clinking wooden cups and passing plates. The wrecked ship behind them smoldered under a patchwork of sails and repairs, but that didn't stop the music and noise. For pirates, wounds healed fast, and reasons to celebrate multiplied even faster. Tonight, the beach belonged to them, and for the moment the world narrowed to emberlight, meat, and the careless joy of being alive. Pirates should eat meat and drink like there's no tomorrow. Right, Jabba? Exactly. Jabba had sunk fully into the mood of the night. He lifted his cup and banged it against Roger's with a satisfied grin. To our fate, becoming friends through fighting. Cheers. Rayleigh sat across the fire, smiling quietly as he wiped down his saber, completely unmoved by the sentimental scene of the three men behaving like long-lost brothers. Kyle rolled his eyes and tore off another chunk of roast to pop into his mouth. It was good, really good. A blessing of the sea and a blaze of fire. He looked at them, gold, silver, bronze, Roger, Rayleigh, Jabba. The nucleus of future legend was all but formed. A small, complicated feeling stirred in Kyle's chest. Was it anxiety, excitement, or the sudden, sharp urge to find his place among these monsters? He did not want to be a mere mascot. No, if he was to belong, he'd push himself toward the iron side of the Roger crew. The King's Three? Interesting. Smoke curled up and painted their faces in amber. Roger laughed and tipped his head back, his voice warm in the night air. Jabba took another heavy swig of wine and licked his lips with a contented smirk. Say, Roger, Jabba slurred, warmth loosening his tongue, why did you go to sea? You always said you wanted to. Hick! Overturn the world. The bonfire's light danced across Roger's face, and for a single instant his usual goofy grin took on an unexpected, almost solemn quality. He chewed slowly, then spoke, voice low and matter-of-fact. A dream, he said. I want to see what's at the end of this great sea, do something nobody else has done. He didn't shout. He didn't boast about crowns, treasure, or power. The words fell like a stone into still water, sending out quiet ripples that reached both Kyle and Jabba. There was no talk of the title Pirate King, no hunger for fame, only a clean, bright curiosity and an unshakable ambition. Jabba stared, stunned. In Roger's eyes he saw an honest light, the same simple, fierce certainty that made his own wanderlust burn. Rayleigh watched with a question in his gaze. Roger, as if sensing the mood had grown too heavy, burst into laughter and shoved Kyle with his greasy arm. Hey, little Kyle, what about you? What's your dream? 3 pairs of eyes settled on him. Rayleigh's, Searching, Jabba's eager, Roger's waiting for entertainment. My dream? Kyle's mind raced. The world's greatest swordsman? No thanks. Too many people would show up to challenge him every day. Conquer the world? Also a hassle. All that hegemony stuff sounded exhausting. Wealth, beauty, fame, power? Now that sounded appealing. Cough, cough. Only joking. Only joking. In a world full of monsters, the usual grand slogans felt hollow, especially sitting here in front of these three would-be legends. Kyle remembered a meme from his previous life. There was a man, red-haired Shanks, one of the four emperors, who wandered the seas with one simple line, "Please give me some face." What an odd kind of power. Pirates weren't just about fighting and bloodshed, they thrived on connections and reputation. Face, that was the real treasure. Face fruit, the strongest devil fruit in the pirate world. He'd eaten the boba fruit himself, so who was to say dreams had to follow ordinary rules? A bold, ridiculous idea began to take shape in his head. Kyle set the wooden bowl down, cleared his throat, puffed his chest, and copied Roger's confident stance, letting a wide, meaningful smile spread across his face. My dream, you see, he said, dragging the words out on purpose, successfully making everyone lean in with curiosity. My goal is to become the king of connections. Huh? Roger, Jabba, and even the normally unflappable Rayleigh went silent, expressions frozen. King of connections? Jabba repeated, baffled, his brow creased. Roger was the first to react. He exploded into loud, incredulous laughter. What kind of mad dream is that? He roared. Do you want to be a king, or do you want to know everyone in the world? Kyle lifted a finger calmly, a look on his face that said, row. You'll understand when you're older. Tell me, he said. What do you think is the strongest power on this sea? Hockey, of course, Jabba answered without hesitation. Powerful devil fruits? Roger suggested with a grin. An unbreakable will, Rayleigh offered quietly. Kyle shook his head, his smile turning a little patronizing. You're all thinking too narrowly. Young pirates, the greatest power on this ocean isn't hockey or devil fruits or sheer will. It's relationships, it's connections, it's what some people call face. He rose and began pacing in front of the bonfire, his voice warming with conviction. Imagine this. When we run into pirates, I pick up a Den Mushi, and the fleet admiral answers, Brother Kyle, sit tight, I'll dispatch a marine battleship to your position right away. When our coffers run dry, I ring another Den Mushi, and the richest man in the world says, Brother Kyle, don't worry about money, spend whatever you need. When we face a powerful foe, I stroll up, clap him on the shoulder, and say, show me some respect, and he immediately backs down like a beaten dog. The more Kyle talked, the more pumped he became, as if he could already see the scene play out before him. His left hand linked with the fleet admirals, his right arm thrown around the head of the Revolutionary Army, both of them bowing to him, and the celestial dragons groveling at his feet. I won't have to lift a finger. A word, a look, and the whole world will revolve around me. This is my dream. I want my name, my face, to become the most trusted currency on this great sea. I want to be the king of connections. He finished, hands on his hips, striking what he thought was an impossibly cool pose, waiting for admiring applause. Instead, the group fell into an awkward, heavy silence. Only the bonfire crackled. Roger stood with his mouth hanging open, so stunned he forgot the chunk of meat still in his hand. Jabba's face looked as if he'd just seen sea kings flying through the sky. Rayleigh pushed his glasses up with a complicated expression behind the lenses, as though he were looking at a genius and an incomparable fool at the same time. Then Roger burst out laughing. It was a laugh that broke the silence, huge, wheezing, tears springing to his eye. It's until he doubled over. This is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. King of connections. Koo-ha-ha! Kyle, what on earth is going on in your head? Jabba couldn't help himself and laughed too. At first the idea sounded absurd, but the more he thought about it, the more strangely impressive it seemed. Rayleigh gave a rueful smile. Ridiculous as it sounds, he said. If it could actually be done, in a way it would be unstoppable. Kyle watched them. There was no mockery in their laughter, only genuine amusement and somehow recognition. A warm glow spread through his chest. Roger wiped his eyes, hoisted a massive cask of sake, and shouted with a grin. Then it's settled. I'll reach the end of the world. Kyle will be the king of connections. The whole world will have to show him respect. Jabba will travel the globe. Rayleigh. He turned to Rayleigh. Rayleigh only smiled and lifted his cup. As for me, he said, I just want to see with my own eyes what kind of chaos you lot will unleash on this world. A rough, delighted laugh broke out. Kuahaha! Excellent! Cheers! 4 drinking vessels, cups, and even a battered keg clinked loudly together above the bonfire. Chapter 17. Mental Hospital. Kyle fumbled up onto the sand just after dawn, his vision a blur. 2 over-enthusiastic brutes on the beach had already started their morning routine. Ora, 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 one bellowed. Muda, 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 the other answered. Roger and Jabba, one swinging a sword, the other a battle-axe, were locked in a showy, utterly unnecessary duel. The clash of steel and the pair's full-throated shouts sent pulsing shockwaves through the air that attacked Kyle's fragile nerves like a jackhammer. Roger even flashed a grin at him mid-swing. Morning, Kyle. Sleep well? My head, Kyle muttered, pressing his palms to his temples as if he could keep his skull from rattling loose. It felt like his brains were being shaken into tofu. Jabba shrugged off Roger's blade with an axe and shook his head. Young people and their poor recovery, he chuckled. A warm, comforting scent cut through the chaos. Coffee. Rayleigh sat beside the smoldering bonfire, unperturbed, methodically pouring from a small pot into a wooden cup. He looked as if the racket around him didn't exist. Want a cup? He asked, holding it out to Kyle. Kyle scrambled to his feet, the warm liquid sliding down his throat and loosening the last of the fog. Speaking of which, he said, eyeing the battered boat they'd abandoned on the shore, we need to talk transportation. If we try to cram Mr. Jabba onto that thing, it'll sink in protest. You might survive, but I'm a goner. Rayleigh took a slow sip of his coffee, regarded the boat, and nodded. It has fulfilled its mission. Hey, how can you say that? Roger protested. His morning exercise with Jabba had apparently finished a while ago. He stood nearby, patting the hull with a mournful expression. It was our first companion when we set sail. You can't just leave it like this. The boat gave a plaintive groan under Roger's hand, as if in agreement. Jabba's booming voice rumbled back. A boat's worth isn't in the newness of its planks, but in the dreams it carried. Kyle stared at the two of them, both so theatrically sentimental, and couldn't help but think they were being absolute fools. Gentlemen, Kyle said, pointing at the hull's hairline cracks, crudely stuffed with seaweed and mud, and then to the mast that looked like it could snap at any moment. That boat's about to give up the ghost, and with Mr. Jabba's bulk, plus those 2 axes that must weigh at least 100 caddies apiece, roughly 50 kilograms each, are you sure it won't split in half the moment we step on it? Koo-ha-ha! Mere trifles. Roger waved him off, grinning and full of bravado. A true pirate could cross the ocean on a single plank. These sorts of inconveniences are perfect for honing our survival skills. I don't want to hone those survival skills, Kyle bellowed, his voice carrying down the beach. In the end, the vote was 2-1, Rayleigh abstaining, and Kyle's objections were steamrolled. They agreed to use the rickety boat for now and save up for a larger one as soon as possible. Under Kyle's dismayed glare, Roger and Jabba cheerfully began hauling their supplies, mostly barrels of wine and cured meat, onto the boat. With every cask they set down, the hull let out a sickening creak and sank a little deeper. When it was Kyle's turn to board, he stood by the boat and took a deep breath, his face set with grim resolve. He reached out and patted the weathered hull as if comforting an old companion. Old friend, he whispered, you've done your best. If we do sink, please go slowly. At least give me time to grab a piece of wood. Kyle, stop dawdling. We're casting off, Roger called from the bow. Kyle squared his shoulders, shut his eyes, and stepped onto the deck. No sooner had he done so than the plank under his feet let out a long, mournful creak, and the little boat lurched toward him, nearly dumping him into the sea. See? I told you, he cried, white as a sheet, clutching the rail. Relax, it's just saying hello, Roger grinned, and the skiff rocked free of the sand and drifted out across the blue. The moment they cleared the shore, trouble followed. There was a thud from below, then a geyser of water spouting from a crack in the deck, splashing Kyle square in the face. Ah! He yelled. The boat's leaking. It's where Roger smashed through when he was moving the wine barrel. Kyle wiped seawater from his face, his voice pitching up with exasperation. Oh, small problem. Roger glanced at the spray, casually plucked a cork from an empty wine barrel nearby, ran over, jammed it into the hole, and stomped down hard. Thud. The cork seated perfectly, and the fountain of water vanished as if it had never been. Roger clapped, wearing that smug, I-fixed-it look. Kyle's eye twitched. Really? That's like putting a Band-Aid on an artery. Before he could say more, Rayleigh's steady voice cut through. Roger, the sail won't go up. Everyone turned to see Rayleigh hauling on the halyard. The other end of the rope hung limply in his hands. Severely worn hemp had given way and split cleanly under tension. With a great whoosh, the enormous sail sprang open like a giant net and billowed down over the mast, swallowing Jabba who'd been standing beneath it. Ugh! Jabba's voice muffled under the canvas. Mr. Jabba, are you all right? Kyle shouted. The canvas bulged, then a thick, muscled arm pushed through and gave a thumbs up. I'm fine. This canvas, it's very tough. Good material, someone called. Kuha! Jabba, you can just help hold the sail. Roger laughed and waved him off. So for the rest of the voyage, Jabba became a human mast, planting his huge frame against the canvas and using his arms to hold the sail at an angle that would catch the wind. Kyle was too stunned to protest. Rayleigh at the helm gave a small, surprised sound. Kyle felt his heart drop and a cold premonition crawl up his spine. He turned rigidly and saw Rayleigh lift his right hand. Clutched in it was a single splintered piece of wood. The tiller had snapped clean off. Silence fell over the ship, broken only by the wind and the slap of waves. Kyle stood frozen, mouth parting. Well, Rayleigh said, staring at the broken tiller with a troubled look, this is a bit of a problem. Koo-ha! Roger's booming laugh shattered the hush. How entertaining. Now even the rudder's gone. This voyage certainly won't be boring, he crowed. He spun toward Jabba, mischief lighting his eyes. Jabba, lend me your axe. Jabba's face brightened at once, as if he'd been hoping for this very idea. Good thinking. If we stick the blade in the water, we can steer it. Exactly. They nodded to each other like two conspirators who had just solved the world's problems. No, Kyle wailed. Are you going to tear the boat apart for spare parts? Nobody bothered to answer his despair. Jabba handed over a heavy battle axe without hesitation. Roger sprinted to the stern, drove the blade into the sea, and began sweeping it from side to side like a makeshift oar. The little skiff lurched forward in a ridiculous wobbling S-curve under his enthusiastic piloting. Kyle gave up fighting. He slumped onto the deck as cold spray splashed his face. The only thing on the mind of the man who fancied himself the king of connections was a single frantic prayer. May all those connections be useful if they end up inside a sea king's belly. Yo-ho! Someone shouted, the chant trailing off into the wind as the boat careened on. Little ones, sing, Roger cried, grinning as he paddled. Binks brew, we'll deliver to you, the crew answered. Jabba and Rayleigh joined the tune with a hummed undercurrent, their bold, cheerful voices spilling across the water. Kyle covered his face with both hands. This wasn't just a pirate ship, he thought. This was a floating mental asylum. 18. 2 years. 2 years was enough time for a young man to outgrow some of his immaturity. Not all of it, mind you. And enough time for a creaky little skiff, one that used to look like it might fall apart at any moment, to be patched and refitted into a mid-sized sailboat that at least gave the impression it wouldn't sink the next minute. The ship had been donated out of friendship by a certain short-sighted pirate crew, and right now the deck looked every inch the gift, chaotic, sticky, and thoroughly lived in. Drink, drink, drink. A short barrel-chested man with a Viking beard was downing an entire barrel of rum in one go. This was Miller Pine. His weapon, slung across his back in all its absurdity, was a giant spiked hammer. Across from him sat Jabba, who had already laid aside enough empty barrels to form a small, wobbling mountain. Burp, Miller, you're hopeless. Your face is pale, Jabba said, nonchalant as ever, setting his barrel down and patting his belly. Lie, this is the flush of excitement, Miller retorted, though his swaying stance betrayed him. Not far away, under the mast, a man with an X-shaped scar across his forehead and a perpetual cigar clenched between his teeth calmly cleaned his pistol. He said nothing, he simply watched. He was Colonel Mugulian, a comrade they'd met 6 months earlier on a Marine base island, a man they'd fought alongside long enough to become friends. He looked at the two men drinking on deck and snorted disdainfully, a wisp of smoke curling from his nostrils. Honestly, two drunks. Colonel Mugulion, isn't it pleasant to enjoy the vigor of youth? Came a smooth voice. Spencer, the swordsman, leaned against the ship's rail with the easy grace of someone who'd never been bothered by a brawl. His red hair was tied back neatly, he wore a fine noble's suit, and a glass of red wine sat in his hand as if he belonged at a salon rather than on a deck. He'd been a guard on a merchant ship until he and his vessel were, as people like to joke, abducted by Roger's personal charm and brought aboard. Mew only grunted and turned his gaze to the crow's nest. He still bore a grudge about Jabba getting him drunk and making a fool of him 2 days ago. Up in the crow's nest, a plump older man cradled his beloved long-barreled sniper rifle, not exactly on watch, more like keeping an eye out while shouting down to the deck. "Hey, you lot, keep it down! You're scaring the seagulls out of my scope!" That was Pittum, the ship's sniper. Kyle sat on the enormous figurehead at the prow, mentally drained. It had been 2 years, and the routine had become second nature. He watched the crew move across the deck. Nozdon, a hulking man with a pointed head that somehow reminded Kyle of an old friend. Isaac, quiet and deadly with a sword. Punk Rock, forever fiddling with odd machines. And Brumarine, who kept the ship's log with fastidious care. The Roger Pirates had grown from a makeshift 4-man outfit into a 12-strong crew, finally beginning to feel like a real ship. In Kyle's memories from his previous life, they had been nothing more than a few lines of text and blurry silhouettes. Now they were flesh and blood, each with a distinct personality. He remembered how Roger had convinced the aloof Colonel Mugulion to come aboard by playing Russian roulette with him for 3 days and 3 nights, how Rayleigh had won over the noble Spencer by spending an entire night talking history, politics, poetry, and prose, and how Jabba had persuaded the hard-drinking Miller Pine simply by drinking with him, emptying the taverns of a whole town. Every new addition to the crew came with a story that was as funny as it was exasperating. Kyle, who liked to call himself the King of Connections, had basically become the ship's binder, the one who kept everyone tied together. He'd remember to drop a wedge of lemon into Spencer's red wine because that's how Spencer liked it. He could hold a conversation with Punk Rock about gearboxes and transmissions even though he only understood the basics, and he was the only person who could get Colonel Mugulion to listen to a whole sentence before the cursing started. Kyle's influence wasn't enough to order a fleet admiral to mobilize a war fleet, but aboard this ship it already carried real currency. "Yo, Kyle, spacing out again?" Rayleigh sat down beside him and handed him a steaming cup of black tea. "No." Kyle took the cup and sipped. "Just thinking about the kind of monsters we've gathered on this ship." "Ha ha! Of course, they're the best kind of monsters." Roger's voice came from behind. In an instant, he was at the bow, like a gust of wind, 1 foot on the rail, arms stretched wide as if embracing the whole sea. "My lads, that island up ahead looks interesting. Let's have a feast. Oh. The old tradition of sudden celebratory banquets was alive and well. The cry sent a thunderous cheer rippling across the deck. Miller and Jabba set their barrels down with a clatter. Colonel Mugulion clipped his pistol back into its holster, and Pittum came tumbling down from the crow's nest, nearly putting a hole in the planks when he hit the deck. Everyone wore the same expression, wide-eyed, eager, and utterly ready for whatever came next. "Captain," Spencer said, trying for caution, "the chart marks this as an unlisted summer island. It could hold unknown dangers." "Doesn't that make it more interesting?" Roger called back, turning with a grin that flashed like sunlight off a blade, teeth bright and bold. "Exactly. Adventure! Adventure!" Nozdon threw his arm up, an arm thicker than Kyle's whole torso, and bellowed, his voice rolling like thunder. The deck answered with laughter and shouts. Watching the chaos, Kyle rested his forehead in his palm and felt a warm, steady current run through his chest. He had once thought the strength of the Roger Pirates rested mainly in the core trio of Roger, Rayleigh, and Jabba. Now, looking at the faces around him, he understood. Every man on this ship mattered. They were a ragged, eccentric collection of people, the kind of crew that once united would one day shock the world. There were no rigid ranks aboard the ship, no petty feuds. The captain would tack the course at a whim because some idea sounded interesting, and the crew would wager everything they owned on the outcome of the silliest contests. They celebrated each other's wins with whoops and cheers, and when someone fell, they quietly passed him a drink. Freedom, ease, camaraderie. Kyle glanced back. Roger was standing aft, waving both arms wildly, sunlight pouring over him. That unrestrained joy, that sense of boundless freedom, it had the same infectious energy as the night 2 years ago. Kyle called out, half annoyed, half smiling, "I'm coming. Geez, what's the rush?" But his feet were light as he hurried forward. He felt bone-tired and knew none of them were reliable in the usual sense, but it didn't matter. It was so damn good to be here. "Hey, you lot, quiet down," someone yelled. "Yes, little Kyle," came the chorus. "Seriously? I was the third person to join this ship. You owe me some respect. Call me Senior, okay? Senior." All right, Senior little Kyle," someone mocked. "You idiot," Kyle snapped, then couldn't help laughing along with them. "Ha ha!" the crew howled, and the sound rolled over the deck like sunlight. The sea was calm, and the sun hung just right. The Roger Pirates' new ship cut a steady line through the water. Not yet the legendary Oro Jackson it would one day become, but a vast improvement over the rickety little craft that might have fallen apart at any moment. The crew lounged and joked on deck, and for once, Kyle allowed himself a quiet moment. He leaned against the rail, idly holding a fishing rod with no bait, mostly for the pose and the peacefulness. Over the past 2 years, men had come aboard one by one, and Roger's bounty had shot up as if on a rocket. With the notoriety came more frequent, friendly greetings from the Marines. "Island spotted ahead," came Pittam's call from the crow's nest, his voice cutting through the lazy calm. "Wait, in front of the island, there are Marines, several ships. The lead ship, its flag shows a rear admiral." "Marines? Rear admiral?" The deck erupted into activity. Miller Pine set down his barrel of liquor and picked up a heavy iron hammer, cracking his knuckles as if waking the weapon to life. Colonel Mugulian spat into the deck without a word. His eyes went hard, and his hand slid to the hilt of his gun. Spencer sighed delicately, as if lamenting the interruption of his afternoon tea. "Coo-ha-ha! Just in time for a warm-up!" Roger came barreling out of the captain's cabin, face alight with excitement. "It's only a few Marines. Do we need all this fuss?" Kyle said, tucking his fishing rod away and stretching lazily. He cast a quick look at the eager newcomers on deck and let a knowing smile play across his face. The moment had come. He'd made his place on this ship over the last 2 years. Part charm, part ambition, always networking toward his half-joking dream of being the king of connections. But Kyle knew words and smiles only took him so far. If they were going to stand their ground against these toughs, he needed to show strength. He hadn't earned his seniority through longevity and a silver tongue alone. Respect sometimes had to be taken with fists. "It's just a rear admiral's fleet," he said lightly. "No need for the captain and first mate to get their hands dirty." He rolled his wrists, took a couple of deliberate steps forward, and planted himself before the others, ready. "It's a perfect chance for the newcomers to see what our senior can do." The deck fell instantly silent. Every head turned toward him. "Oh." Jabba was the first to cheer, slinging an arm around Kyle's shoulders with a wide grin. "Little Kyle's going to put on a show. Don't go falling into the sea. That'd be embarrassing," Miller Pine called out, laughing. Colonel Mugulian snorted softly. He'd heard the older crew boast of Kyle's strength, but had yet to see it for himself. "Coo-ha-ha! This'll be good." Roger laughed the loudest. "All right then, Kyle. Show us. Make it quick, though. The feast waits." Rayleigh only smiled, pushing his glasses up as he watched Kyle's back with a look of approval and quiet expectation. Given the captain's go-ahead, Kyle didn't waste any more time. He drew a deep breath and crouched slightly, coiling himself. Sonic step. Instant! A thunderous boom ripped through the air. The deck timbers creaked and sank beneath Kyle's feet as he blasted upward like a cannonball. The force of his launch rocked the massive ship. "Oh, amazing!" The new crew members on deck gaped, eyes shining. Kyle traced a graceful arc through the air. Just as it looked like he'd lost momentum and would fall, he planted his right foot on nothing. Bang! A small sonic boom cracked, the air rippling visibly, and the backward thrust sent him up again. He altered course and surged forward in an impossible zigzag, as if stepping up a flight of invisible stairs. Moonwalk. Colonel Mugulian murmured, then shook his head. No, that's not it. What is that? That's Kyle's devil fruit power, Rayleigh said from beside him. He uses shockwaves as footholds. A collective gasp of admiration swept the deck. The ever-smiling, deceptively harmless-looking little Kyle was outrageous. He'd already crossed hundreds of meters over the sea, and the Marine fleet was closing fast. Kyle couldn't help the chuckle that rose in him. Young Marines, feel the harshness of the sea. From his vantage point above, Kyle could clearly see the Marines on the main ship's deck. Panicked faces, fingers pointed at the sky as if they were staring at some alien apparition. Perfect. The dramatic entrance was working. Now for the grand cleanup. He toyed with options in his head. Onigiri, Baku homing to wash the deck, or a light illusion mirage to make them turn on each other. He was about to decide when a booming, hearty voice from the main ship below cut through the air, so loud and full of life it felt like it shook his very DNA. Huh? What's that up in the sky? Some weird bird? Then came the unmistakable crisp crunch, senbei being chewed. Lads, look at that ship. That's the Roger pirates, making trouble again. Roger, you won't escape this time. Surrender and accept the judgment of justice. Kyle froze in midair, his smile locked in place, his whole body suddenly rigid. Cold sweat prickled along his forehead. That passionate voice, that laugh, and that damned familiar crunching of senbei. Oh no, he hadn't realized at first, but now it hit him full force. Sorry, sir. I didn't recognize you earlier. The voice mocked, playful but dangerous. Rear Admiral, screw your Rear Admiral. Can Garp be just any Rear Admiral? Look me in the eye and tell me he's just another officer. The name bounced through Kyle's head like a punchline and a warning at once. Garp, not just any Rear Admiral. Garp, that man had been a thorn in their side since their first year at sea, chasing them across half the Grand Line. Kyle could already picture him up there, Garp, picking his nose and giving that look that plainly said, "You're trash." Below on the Roger Pirate's deck, his crewmates were still cheering him on, blissfully oblivious. Go, little Kyle, senpai! Show them the strength of the Roger Pirates! So cool, little Kyle. Kyle was on the verge of tears. He didn't want to go after Garp. If he did anything wrong, the senior would be finished. He pictured Nazdan getting crushed for sure. All he wanted to do was turn around, fly back, and shove Nazdan's head down onto the deck and rub it until it stopped shouting, "Senior is so cool." Then Garp's booming voice cut across the water, warm in that annoying way people use when they've run into an old friend in a foreign port. Oh, it's that brat from the Roger ship, flying along nicely. Want to join the Marines? I can write you a recommendation. Ha! His voice carried clearly on the sea breeze to the Roger pirate's ship. The new crew members, who had been full of admiration a moment before, froze, their smiles curdling into puzzled, awkward expressions. Only a few of the Roger pirates actually wore an "I knew it" look. The rest watched amused. Roger folded his arms and laughed until he shook. Ha! I knew it! Garp says the same thing every time he sees Kyle. Rayleigh shook his head with an amused smile. Well, in Garp's eyes, Kyle's the most solid, straight-laced one on this ship. Kyle's face darkened at the absurdity of the offer. Join the Marines? Work for Garp? Become his personal punching bag and get served up that infamous fist of love every day? Do I look like someone who enjoys that? He kept his mouth shut and put on a cool, indifferent expression, deciding to ignore Garp's provocation. Garp, he thought, was playing with fire. But Garp wasn't the sort to give up because someone ignored him. He grinned, showing a row of blinding white teeth, an expression that to Kyle was somehow more terrifying than a sea king. Not saying anything? Too shy? Garp rumbled. You little pirate brat, I'll let you feel the warmth of justice myself. Without further ceremony, Garp stooped, scooped up a few cannonballs from the deck, and, with no fuse, no cannon, just his bare arms, sent them streaking through the air. Whoosh! 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 The cannonballs slice past, hurled by sheer muscle and menace, a clear demonstration that Garp's justice came with fists and force. The black cannonballs were instantly sheathed in a layer of armament hockey, dark as a starless night. They shrieked through the air, turning into a swarm of black meteors that streaked toward Kyle, so fast and forceful they left long white contrails behind them. Kyle broke out in a cold sweat. Holy crap, as expected of the King's Garp. Even if one hit didn't shred him to pieces, The impact alone would shatter bones and send him tumbling into the sea to become dinner for the Sea Kings. His escape was completely cut off. There was nowhere to dodge. Their timing and angle had him perfectly covered. He couldn't run. Was Kyle, the senior, self-styled king of connections, really going to choke here? He could already feel the new guys watching him. Should he even try to avoid that lethal edge in front of them? "Captain, save me! Captain, save me!" In an instant, Kyle's face snapped from terror to iron resolve. He ground his teeth, reached behind him, and a pitch-black antique naginata materialized in his hand as if summoned from shadow. The blade hummed, a low, electric buzz that sliced through the chaos. He poured everything into his Boba Fruit ability. Beyond coating the weapon with armament hockey, the naginata's edge shimmered with a layer of extremely fast, high-frequency vibrations. The air around it complained and strained under the force. "Come on, you old geezer," Kyle snarled. Both hands locked on the shaft, he didn't fall back. He charged straight at the deadly black cannonballs streaking toward them. "Onigiri. Baku homing," he bellowed. Rather than a single slash, he unleashed the technique as a continuous, flowing barrage. The naginata became a whirlwind of motion, leaving a scattering of afterimages as each precise arc met its target. The hockey-clad iron shells smashed against the blade in showers of blinding sparks and thunderous metallic clangs. Even stranger, each strike was more than a simple chop. The high-frequency sound waves Kyle had infused into his blade detonated the moment they struck the cannonballs. Boom! The first shot, not even 10 meters away, disintegrated under the shockwave, its impact erupting into a circular gust of air that radiated outward. Kyle rode the recoil, spinning smoothly through the air to avoid the blast, and his naginata described a graceful arc as it met the second cannonball. Rumble! The second shot exploded in midair, splashing fire and black smoke across the sky. The new crew on deck stood frozen, mouths agape. Miller Pine stared, wine barrels slipping from his fingers and clattering to the deck. Colonel Mugulian's cigar had gone out somewhere along the way. He watched the one-sided fireworks overhead with his eyes wide in disbelief. It was neither mere swordsmanship nor merely a devil fruit display, but a flawless fusion of both, each strike carrying an explosive, precise force, brilliant, brutal, and possessed of a wild, violent beauty. Spencer's usual composed elegance had disappeared. He stood dazed, eyes unfocused, as if watching something beyond his understanding. "This is our senior on the ship?" Nosden muttered, his pointy head bobbing like a rattle. "Amazing." Above them, Kyle had already sliced through the third and fourth cannonballs. He used the air currents and the shock waves from the explosions as makeshift footholds. Each blast launched him into a new position so he could meet the next round from an unpredictable angle. His tremor step and blade work became one motion. Offense and defense perfectly fused. Boom! The final cannonball shattered at the closest possible point to him. The ensuing explosion almost swallowed his whole form. "Kyle!" The Roger pirates instinctively felt their chests tighten at the sight. Only the old hands, Roger and Rayleigh, remained with arms folded, grins widening, their eyes bright with approval. "Ha! Not bad!" As the blaze faded, embers drifted away and the firelight dispersed. Kyle reappeared in the sky, naginata clutched in a trembling hand. His clothes were ripped in several places from the blast. He looked messy and beaten, but his eyes were locked on the marine battleship below with an unyielding defiance. For a long beat, the deck was utterly silent. The new crew watched the small figure suspended above them, not tall, but somehow holding the whole sky up, and any trace of earlier contempt vanished. They'd always known little Kyle Senpai as the kid who smiled, swept the decks, and handled the ship's chores. He came across more like a gentle butler than a warrior. Now, seeing him like this, their mouths went dry. He wasn't just capable, he was a monster, a real monster, someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the captain and vice-captain. "Wait, he's only 8, someone whispered. No sooner had that question slipped out than someone on Garp's battleship barked, "Old geezer!" The words froze, the air. On the Roger side, the newcomer's jaws dropped open. Garp himself looked taken aback for a moment, then his grin spread into something dangerously gleeful. "You brat, I'm only in my 20s, he snapped. A voice sneered from the deck above. "It seems Fist of Love wasn't enough to teach you a lesson." Kyle knew he was playing with fire. He also knew he couldn't show weakness. After putting on a spectacle like that, backing down wasn't an option. He drew a long breath, pressing down hard on his trembling right hand. The boba fruit's power surged through him again. Now it's my turn. He spun the naginata so fast the blade sang, a thin, keening whistle that cut the air and slammed into the sea. Vortex, Azure Dragon Twister! An invisible force ripped a towering column of water skyward, wrapping itself around Kyle's spinning naginata. The wind's vibration and the roaring whirl of seawater fused into a single, terrible shape, a tornado that bridged sea and sky like an enormous coiling azure dragon. Inside that spiraling wall, high-frequency sound waves rasped against the water currents, combining into a shrill, dragon-like bellow that swept straight toward the marine fleet. Kyle kept the core of the attack deliberately restrained. It wasn't meant to obliterate so much as to seize and hurl. The tornado's central destructive blast was modest, but its sucking power and blunt impact were devastating. Wah! Help! I'm falling! Oh no! Men screamed as decks tilted and rigging snapped. Sailors were thrown off balance, cargo slid, and a few unlucky souls tumbled into the frothing churn where the Azure Dragon Twister met the fleet. The sea answered with a thunderous, watery roar as Kyle drove his power forward. The ship's gonna capsize. Chaos tore through the marine fleet. Men caught in the tornado's outer winds were snatched up and flung into the sea with screams, like dumplings tossed into a boiling pot. Ships pitched and rolled violently, masts snapped, and formations collapsed as the storm shredded their defenses. You damn brat! Seeing his crews being toyed with, Garp could no longer stand idly by. He planted his feet and stamped, wood splintered and the deck buckled under him. He compressed his form, becoming a cannonball too fast for the eye to follow, and rocketed into the sky. Fistbone, Meteor. As he flew, his right fist was sheathed in pitch-black armament hockey, so concentrated it distorted the light around it. His fist became a black meteor from the heavens, hurtling straight for Kyle with a catastrophic force that threatened to obliterate anything in its path. Every hair on Kyle's body rose. One thought hammered in his mind. I'm going to die. I'm really going to die. A moment ago, little Kyle Senpai had been all bluster, charging at the future marine hero without a second thought. Now every last ounce of bravado evaporated. He threw himself on the deck, and with everything he had, let out a ragged, desperate wail. Captain, save me! The pitiful cry rang out over the sea, raw with fear and the will to live. On board the Roger Pirate's ship, the newcomers went from stunned to stupefied to outright bewildered. Where had the terrifying, impossibly cool senior who just squared off against an entire marine fleet gone? A booming laugh cut through the confusion. Ha! Ha! Roger's rich, rolling guffaw seemed to scatter the clouds itself. Just as Garp's iron fist was about to come crashing down on Kyle, a silhouette slid between them like a ghost. Roger's red captain's coat snapped in the wind. One hand held his straw hat down, the other rested on the hilt of the sword at his waist. He called a single word, ace, then moved. God avoidance, he shouted, and with no wasted motion, he executed a simple horizontal slash. Conqueror's hockey, deep crimson and crackling like lightning, raced along the blade. It didn't even need to touch Garp's fist. The slash tore through the air between them with enough force to stop the strike. Buzz! Garp's fistbone, Meteor, and Roger's God Avoidance collided and canceled one another out, not with a conventional explosion, but with a silence that felt even louder. An almost unimaginable blast of wind pressure followed, forcing a several 100-meter-wide depression into the sea below and tearing a huge hole through the clouds overhead. Roger stood there like a born ruler, the bearing of an emperor. Yo, Garp, long time no see, still as energetic as ever, he called, grinning and flashing a mouthful of white teeth. Garp landed on the mast of a nearby warship, fist clenched, laughing just as freely. You old bastard, where do you think you're running off to this time? He shouted back. The instant their eyes met, words were unnecessary. War broke out across the waves. Lads, it's war, Roger roared. Decks erupted in movement. The Roger pirates answered like a living tide. Miller Pine, swinging a massive hammer, Colonel Mugulion, firing both pistols in a twin spray, Spencer's rapier singing through the air with a cold, elegant glint. Like tigers leaping from cliffs, Roger's men poured down onto the enemy, charging headlong into the equally ready Marine fleet. Cannon smoke, clashing steel, and battle cries filled the sky and sea. Ships closed, boarding hooks flew, and men met men in a furious storm of combat. Elsewhere, the scene shifted. The setting sun turned sky and sea the color of molten copper. On the island beach that had been a battleground hours earlier, great bonfires now crackled while the smell of roasted meat blended with the warm tang of rum. The deafening shouts of combat had given way to laughter and the clink of glasses. Pirates and Marines sat opposite one another around the fires, but the mood was oddly convivial. Roger and Garp sat arm in arm, each gnawing on a massive roasted leg, arguing loudly about something as bits of food and spittle flew. Rayleigh, ever the gentleman, was delicately clinking glasses with a Marine lieutenant commander, trading notes on the brewing process of some famous wine. Jabba and Miller Pine had already paired off with the fleet's biggest drinkers and were in the middle of a boisterous drinking contest. Only the newcomers from both sides, the fresh recruits of the Roger Pirates and the young Marines from Garp's fleet, stood clustered at the edge of the scene, completely bewildered and unsure what to make of it all. Nozdon's pointed head swam with question marks. He leaned toward Isaac and whispered, "Aren't we supposed to be fighting the Marines?" Isaac only shook his head quietly. He didn't understand either. Nearby, a freshly graduated recruit from the Marine Academy stood frozen, watching his hero, Vice Admiral Garp, laughing and trading easy conversation with the most notorious pirate of the age, Roger. The sight cracked the young Marine's worldview so suddenly it threatened to fall apart and reassemble into something unrecognizable. "You'll get used to it," an older, full-bearded veteran of the Marines said, clapping the recruit on the shoulder as he took a long pull from his bottle. The young man swallowed and asked, voice trembling, "Senior, what exactly is going on?" The veteran gave a rueful chuckle and shook his head. "That's the thing about this world," he said. "Politics and power make strange bedfellows. Don't try to make sense of it all at once. Just learn to read the situation and do your duty." "Garp and that Roger, they have a relationship like that," the old veteran said with a belch. "Every time they meet, they have to thrash the heavens and the earth. If they don't tear down each other's ships and sink a few islands, it doesn't count as a proper greeting." "Fighting as a greeting?" someone asked, incredulous. "Yes," the old man replied. "And when the fighting's over, if they're in a good mood, they'll sit down to a feast together, just like now." He nodded toward the opposite side of the dock. "Those pirates are a nuisance, but I'll give them this. Their barbecue is pretty good." On the pirate side, Spencer was explaining the same thing to the newcomers with an air of resigned amusement. "The captain and Mr. Garp are sworn rivals. More than that, in a way, they're kindred spirits. Their battles are almost ritual, a way to check that the other is still standing. Of course, that only works if neither side is trying to actually kill the other." He paused and glanced over at Kyle, who was being held in a headlock by Garp, face scrunched in displeasure as he was forced to gulp down a cup of juice. "And as long as Kyle's around, Mr. Thrinoro, Garp always holds back a bit." Kyle spat juice and protested. "Not true. That old man shows no mercy." "Why do you think that is?" Nosden asked, curious. Spencer shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe Garp has a soft spot for him. Maybe Kyle reminds him of someone. Or maybe it's just tradition. When Kyle's there, the fights never get truly ugly." He smiled. "Whatever the reason, the show always ends with food and drink. It's the only greeting those two would both agree on. Garp really thinks we've got a future admiral aboard this ship." At that, everyone turned to look. "Brat," Garp bellowed, grinning ear to ear. "I'm telling you, being a Marine is a man's calling. You've got a bright future. Come with me and uphold justice." He laughed and clapped Kyle on the back so hard Kyle sputtered. "Cough, cough, I refuse. Are you trying to pat me to death so you can inherit my treasures?" Kyle protested, face flushed from the blows and the laughter. The absurd, good-natured scene made the newcomers exchange amused glances. After a moment, a young Marine worked up the nerve, picked up a chunk of roasted meat, and carefully offered it across the table to a pirate. The pirate blinked in surprise, then broke into a grin and raised his cup to clink it in return.